Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku was chosen by the gods part 3. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 4, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story, SweetBbyFox from AO3. So let's start the video. Izuku tried his best to sleep. He counted sheep, but those sheep turned into foxes and the foxes turned into Shouto, and then all he could think about was kissing the fool, and so that woke him up more. Besides his lovesick daydreams, with the yokai gone, he definitely could feel the effects of the fever clearer, now that Shouto wasn't there to confuse his body even more. He sat up from the blankets, feeling a little too warm to be comfortable. With a huff, he made a split decision to get up and get a morning snack. His breakfast had been light anyways, and he was curious to what the girls were up to. As he stepped onto the cool floor, a slight shiver ran through him as suddenly he felt too cold. Curse being sick, he hated the fluctuating temperatures, and he wondered if Shouto felt like this or if the yokai was just always comfortable because he could regulate himself. Making a grab for one of the layers of blankets, he wrapped a lighter, softer blue blanket around himself before walking out of the bedroom and down the halls. Approaching the kitchen, he could hear Ōtaka-chan speaking softly. He walked in quietly, holding his own voice back to not want to interrupt their conversation. To his surprise, 𝗬𝗎 wasn't even in the room, as Ochako sat by herself on top of the kitchen counter. She sat in a squatted position, her hands cupped around her mouth as she spoke freely into them, before she paused and blinked up at Izuku in surprise. "You should be resting," she scolded, before turning back to her hands and saying quickly, "I'll talk to you later, Izuku is here now." She clapped her hands, then put them down, smiling innocently at Izuku as he stared back in shock. "What were you doing?" he asked, his curiosity making him want to buzz with eager excitement if it weren't for the dulling headache and chills he felt. "Talking to 𝗕𝗫. He was asking how you were doing, and he was very concerned to hear that you're not feeling well." She grinned, hopping off of the counter with ease, walking over to the doorway where Izuku stood. "Speaking of which, why aren't you resting?" "Got hungry," he mumbled, before squatting down to sit more level with the small shrine spirit. "You were talking through your hands, though? How does that work?" "It's just a yokai thing." She shrugged nonchalantly. "It's pretty similar to your human cellular telephones, I think, except it can only be used with messenger yokai like 𝗕𝗫. It's part of how he can get messages out so fast, and it saves on ink." "So he contacted you then?" Izuku asked. Ochako nodded, her fluffy brown hair bouncing with her. "Yes. I can't contact him back, unfortunately, at least not so instantly." Izuku looked to the floor a little unsurely. "So, how is he doing?" 𝗕𝗫 was an interesting subject for Izuku. Shouto had seemed to forgiven the rabbit yokai already, which was good because Izuku didn't want Shouto to have to bear the burden of holding a grudge on the guy. And according to the shrine spirits, it's thanks to 𝗕𝗫 contacting a healing god so quickly that Izuku was able to get the almost instant care that possibly saved his life. So yes, Izuku was grateful to 𝗕𝗫, but he still didn't quite trust him. After all, it was him that brought Stain to their shrine in the first place, and he did steal the land god mark from Izuku, even if he'd later given it back. From dealing with a vacant, selfish dad most of his life, Izuku knew life was lived a lot better when you're not feeling angry with everyone who's ever wronged you. That being said, it was in his right to be wary. Until he got to know 𝗕𝗫 a little better, he couldn't help feeling a little distrust towards him. Ochako's smile softened at Izuku's polite question, as she understood the hesitation he felt for 𝗕𝗫. "Good. He was actually planning on coming by today. I told him you were sleeping, and so he planned to just stop by real fast with a gift basket and be on his way, but maybe this will be a good chance for you to talk to him a little more. Get to know each other better." He pulled the blankets around himself tighter, shying away beneath the comfy fabric. "I don't know, Ōtaka-chan. Maybe I should hurry back to bed before he dash." There was a loud, firm knock at the front door, making Izuku wince. "Gets here?" 𝗬𝗎 appeared by the door in a poof of smoke, dropping to the floor with a soft thud. She swung the door open, a wide smile on her face as she greeted the messenger yokai. 𝗕𝗫 bowed to her politely, his entire demeanor completely different from when Izuku had first met him. Somehow he seemed lighter, his natural smile on his lips and relaxed but still strong posture standing out. He straightened up, taking a step into the shrine as Ochako hurried and greeted him as well. Izuku took a deep breath, tossed the blanket into the kitchen so he wouldn't look like such a child, and then made his way over to the yokai and shrine spirits. Teriya greeted him first, his smile turning a little awkward as he stuck out a large hand. "Hello again, Izuzuma." He took the offered hand, squeaking in surprise when Teriya brought Izuku's hand to his lips and kissed it softly. "Pardon my intrusion. I'll only be a few minutes if you'll have me." Izuku pulled his hand back, giggling nervously and inwardly cursing himself for acting like this around strong, handsome men. "Oh, of course. It's no problem. I'm sorry I'm not the most presentable right now." The yokai only shook his head, adjusting a messenger bag that hung over his broad shoulders. "Don't worry about it. It's completely understandable for you to be sweating and looking so tired, as you are ill. Nonetheless, I've brought a gift basket that I'm hoping can ease your burdens." "Oh, goodies." Ochako squealed in excitement, nosing her way brought Teriya's bag. He looked slightly offended at first, but his expression warmed as he watched Ochako's face light up when she pulled out a box of mochi. "Can I keep this?" "I promise to share with Tsu-chan," she asked endearingly, with an expression that Izuku was sure no one would be able to say no to. "Of course." Teriya laughed, moving his hand up and down as he added, "Just brush your teeth after, as mochi is full of sugar that can lead to cavities." He then pulled out a literal basket, one much too large to have possibly fit in his average-sized bag. It was filled to the brim with fresh citrusy fruit and vegetables, medicines and herbs that looked foreign and fancy, and some kind of folded-up fabric. Izuku gaped at the huge basket as Teriya offered it, bowing slightly until Izuku took the somewhat heavy basket from him. "How did you fit this in there?" he asked in astonishment, placing it on the table behind him. "Messenger god bags can fit much more than the eye can see," Teriya declared proudly. "Otherwise I'd have to carry around multiple bags for all the letters and things I'm delivering daily, and that would be inconvenient." Izuku nodded, though he didn't entirely understand, and then he glanced back at the generous basket. "Thank you for all of this, you really didn't have to. It's just a fever, nothing some sleep can't cure." He scratched the back of his head in embarrassment, flattered by the yokai's generosity, but also feeling a little guilty. "It's the least I can do," Teriya answered sincerely. "After all, I put you through much tribulations, and I also owe you my literal life. Thank you, Izuku-sama, for sacrificing yourself in order to help defeat Stain and ultimately saving my life." He bowed again, this time kneeling down at Izuku's fuzzy, striped feet. "Oh, I. Izuku stuttered, his throat struggling to speak and his chest aching as his eyes watered dramatically. He was touched, a little embarrassed too, as his cheeks were pink and wet with grateful tears. "It's nothing really. I'm just glad everyone was okay in the end." As he wiped at his eyes with the baggy sleeves of his sweater, Teriya stood back up. "I know you need your rest, but would you mind if cooked up a delicious beef stew? Recipe from my proud and beautiful goddess of a mother." He grinned, looking down at Izuku as he stood tall beside the smaller boy. Izuku smiled back, his stomach gurgling loudly as an answer in itself. "That would be awesome. I'm actually starving too." He followed the rabbit yokai towards the kitchen, thinking to himself that maybe it wouldn't be so hard to forgive Teriya after all. Shouto, who normally in times of crisis kept to himself and handled things in a calm manner, needed to talk to someone. His first instinct was to find Momo and speak with her, but that only made him feel even more upset and anxious, as obviously he still had no idea where she'd gone off to for the last 20 years. Then he thought of his mother, and that just made him downright sad, more ice forming on his arms up to his shoulders as he trembled and ached for his past mother. What would he give to talk to her again just so he could get her advice? She knew all about humans loving her and her loving them, and maybe she could offer some help on the situation. Of course, she did already give him advice on humans. The memory of her voice, laced with exhaustion and grief, cried loud in his head. If a human and yokai are together, it will only end in disappointment and devastation. As he sat against the elevator wall in a near panic, he didn't notice the doors had closed and he was moving up to the next floor. He barely registered when the doors opened again, revealing a tired-looking 𝗘𝗁𝗅, guitar strapped to her back and a single plain waffle in one of her hands. She blinked at Shouto in shock, unsure of what to do or how to react to the yokai who was clearly having some kind of mental breakdown. Hey Fox? You okay there?" she said slowly, carefully, as if she was afraid he would suddenly flee like a scared animal. The short-haired woman stepped into the elevator, considering Shouto's silence for a moment, before deciding to drag him towards her dressing room. She grabbed him roughly with her free hand, lifting him up so that he clumsily followed her back to her room. His arm was freezing in her hand, and as soon as she tossed him into her room and closed the door behind her, she hurried over to grab a jacket and wrap her pink, slightly stinging hand in it to warm it up. "Shouto?" She glared, her face looking intimidating in an attractive way with her thick eyeliner and dark lipstick she sported that day. Turning to find him slumped on the floor in defeat, she spoke louder, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" That caught his attention, as his face snapped up to look at her as if seeing her for the first time. "𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏," he said, voice cracking slightly. "Where's Izuku?" she demanded, crossing her arms over her chest as she marched over to him. "Is he hurt? Why are you like this? And what the hell happened to your hair?" He looked down to the floor, his frown somehow deepening even more as he seemed to struggle to find the words to say. 𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏 tapped her foot impatiently, her narrow eyes watching Shouto as she waited for some kind of explanation. His red and white head fell back into his hands, his fox ears popping up uncontrollably as he whispered out slowly, like the words hurt him to say. "Izuku is in love with me." A loud and ugly snort came out of 𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏's mouth as she bent down and smacked Shouto in the shoulder. "Well, no shit. Is that what you're freaking out about?" He looked up at her in offense, his growling voice almost yelling in frustration. "𝗕𝗁𝗅, he is a human. And I'm a yokai. Okay?" She rolled her eyes, plopping herself down casually in her beanbag chair in another part of the small room. "He knows that already. And even if he didn't, wouldn't be all that big of a deal anyways. In fact, I'm pretty sure that one of Mina's friends might be dating a yokai, and I'm almost positive he has no idea." "How is it not a big deal?" Shouto demanded, bristling with frustration that only amused 𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏. "How is it a big deal?" She retorted back, arms crossed over her chest as she stared back just as fiercely but with a smirk on her lips. "And I thought Izuku was the dramatic one, but wow, Fox, you're ridiculous." The red and white-haired yokai looked torn, biting his lip as his gaze lowered. "It's not safe, okay? I know from personal experience, or witnessing it at least, that it's not acceptable for humans and yokai to be together." "Says who, Shouto? Is there someone that's going to stop you from being with him? Do you just not like him or something?" She said it harsh, hoping to egg him on as she knew Shouto felt something for the human land god. "No. I mean, I don't know, it's not that." His face scrunched up more, an odd expression on his normally controlled face. 𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏 itched to grab her phone and take a picture to study later, as he looked seriously weird so upset like this, but she was kinder than that. His voice lowered again, a barely audible whisper that made her lean forward to listen closer. "I don't want to hurt him, 𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏." She sighed at that, standing up to stand in front of Shouto once again. Her leather boot came forward, kicking him a little hard in the side to get him to look up at her. His ears were back, like a sad puppy, and his expression so earnest, desperate, and maybe a little hopeful. 𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏 bent down, patting his head with her small hand. "Listen, Shouto," she smiled. "Love is risky. That's normal and never going to go away. But just consider that by holding yourself back, and someday possibly rejecting him." 𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏 paused. Shouto's eyes looked away, so she poked him in the forehead, her finger digging its way under his bangs and straight to his skin so that he'd look back at her again. Sometimes refusing to love someone, or refusing to let yourself be loved, will hurt more than anything else could. Shouto didn't thank 𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏 for dealing with his emotional love crisis, as she had mockingly called it, but he did awkwardly tell her that if she ever wanted to talk, he'd listen. His awkward attempts at friendship made her giggle, but also feel warm at the effort. It wasn't like she was any better, much less more experienced, at the whole friendship thing herself anyways. After grabbing her guitar again and offering Shouto her still uneaten waffle, which he declined, they exited the dressing room and headed for the elevators together. They went back to silence, something they both found more comfortable than unnecessary conversation, as they entered the elevator and waited for it to go down. She felt somewhat relieved for the yokai that the land god was sick. It gave Shouto time to process the new information. 𝗕𝗁𝗅𝗧𝗏 pressed the buttons for the main floor and the second floor so Shouto could actually go and get some work done, but to her slight irritation, the elevator remained where it was at. "Stairs, I guess?" She mumbled to Shouto, who gave a short nod of agreement. When she pressed the button to open the doors, nothing happened. She huffed impatiently, pressed it a few more times, each time a little harder than before letting her hand drop to her side, and she turned back to the yokai who frowned at the closed doors. "We're stuck," he said, though it almost sounded like he was asking a question. "Yup," 𝗬𝗂𝘁𝗵 groaned, letting her head fall on the doors loudly. "Great." Shouto came forward, about to see if he could just pull open the doors when the lights began to flicker. His hand on the door paused, glancing up at the old lighting that flickered much too fast for it to be a simple dead light bulb. The two yokai looked at each other in concern, 𝗬𝗂𝘁 opening her mouth to say something when suddenly the lights went out completely. With his left hand, his fox ears and tails popping out at the use of his yokai magic, he created a small flame to help them see. 𝗬𝗂𝘁's makeup looked even harsher under the intense light of his flame, her lower lashes creating a dark shadow on her cheeks. She blinked in surprise at the sudden flame, and then glared at Shouto. "Why that face?" she asked suspiciously. He bit his lip, looking away from her face and into the warm orange flame before half chuckling. "Nothing, you just look a little frightening in this lighting." "Asshole," she yelled, kicking blindly at his shin and missing a small smile on her lips as she held back her own laughter. "Anyways, get us out of here, oh mighty familiar to the great and powerful land god." Shouto rolled his eyes, something she almost didn't catch as he began to move back towards the doors. "Maybe I'll just leave you here," he said, voice sounding serious. Yeah, 𝗬𝗂𝘁 laughed, then blinked into the darkness as Shouto's flame suddenly vanished and she heard a low creaking sound from in front of her. The fox yokai had squinted in the darkness, his vision considerably better than 𝗬𝗂𝘁's. With strong grip and some effort, he was able to pry the elevator doors open. He could hear the Tengu woman close behind him as he stepped out cautiously, a flame in the palm of his hands again. Using it to light their way, they headed for the stairwell, silent as they listened to the sounds around them. Shouto could feel goosebumps on his arm, a creepy feeling running over him that made him want to recoil as if he'd touched something disgusting. He glanced at 𝗬𝗂𝘁, seeing her grimace, and knew she felt the same. "There's something here in the stadium. I don't think it's strong, but it's definitely not good." His mismatched eyes, the orange flame reflecting fiercely in each one, looked about cautiously as he hurried down the steps. 𝗬𝗂𝘁 hummed in agreement. "I can sense it too. Do you think the humans are in any danger?" Possibly. Shouto paused, his red ear twitching as he heard a faint scream. That was from the main floor. "Let's split up, I'll head there and you can see if everyone's okay on the second floor." "Okie dokie," 𝗬𝗂𝘁 replied, pulling out her cell phone. "I'll use this for light." Shouto stared at the electric device in her hand, eyes widening slightly as she opened up the flashlight application, and a brighter light than his flame turned on. "Why didn't we just use that?" he asked her in slight annoyance. She smirked at him as she opened the door to the second floor. "Yours was cooler. I'll check up on you later, Fox." With a quick peace sign, she hurried through the doorway while Shouto continued quickly down the steps to the main floor, hoping Izuku's human friends were okay. "So you haven't had any contact with Momo-sama since that night?" Izuku and Tenya sat across from each other at the old oak table, a delicious and hearty bowl of stew in front of each of them. The smaller of the two took another bite of soup, enjoying the delicious taste in his mouth and chewing slowly with eyes contently closed, before swallowing. His large green eyes, tired from fever but also awake from the happy meal, opened, looking up at Tenya with slight embarrassment. The rabbit yokai had been so eager listening to Izuku share his story of meeting the former land god, so he felt bad to end it on a more disappointing note. "No," he replied softly, guilty for the answer. "I haven't seen or heard from her since, I'm sorry." Tenya tried to hide his disappointment, but Izuku noticed the way his shoulders dropped just by millimeters, and the way his grip on his spoon tightened ever so slightly. "It's quite alright. Not your fault after all, at least you having met her means she is at the least safe and sound." "That is the highest priority." Izuku nodded, looking back down to the soup, his eyes watching a soft brown carrot as he moved it around with his spoon. Tenya was a good listener, ever so polite but also incredibly sincere with his responses. When they spoke of Momo, it was obvious how much adoration and love, whatever kind it may be, that he felt for the beautiful woman. "You said you two were lovers?" Izuku asked shyly, blushing at the word and forcing himself to not think of Shouto. About that, 𝗕𝗫 set his spoon down with a soft clang, his volume raising slightly as he then spoke rather fast. "I'd like to apologize for my lie. We were in fact never lovers, and I said it to try and justify my reasons for stealing your mark and to hopefully convince you into thinking that I deserved the land god mark more than you. It was very deceiving, selfish, and wrong of me to say, and I'm sincerely sorry to you, and Momo-sama wherever she may be, for lying." That wasn't what Izuku expected to hear, but he felt a smile form on his lips regardless, as 𝗕𝗫's sincerity was both admirable and a little amusing. "It's fine, I understand." The silence between them was more than awkward after that. They both went back to their soups, the only sounds their soft chewing and moving silverware, and the faintest giggles coming from another room. Izuku's eyes flickered up to 𝗕𝗫's face, watching the masculine man chew his food carefully, as if he was concentrating hard on the task. He wondered what it was like for 𝗕𝗫 in the past, when Momo was the land god and he'd come to visit. Did they sit and eat together like this? Did Shouto join them, or keep to himself working on chores around the shrine? As Izuku scraped out one last spoonful from his nearly empty bowl, the yokai in front of him cleared his throat loudly. For not only being a human, but also only being a land god for such a short amount of time, your talisman skills are remarkable. Izuku tilted his head in confusion, positive that he hadn't used any talisman in quite some time, and his skills with them were nowhere near the quality that 𝗕𝗫 seemed to believe they were. "What do you mean?" he asked, his eyebrows furrowing. "Isn't that how you've gotten Shouto to do your human labor for you?" 𝗕𝗫 adjusted his glasses, frowning like what he was saying was obvious. "No?" Izuku pouted, moving his empty bowl to the side and sitting back against the chair. "He actually offered to go. I was going to ask him, but he beat me to it." "You mean he voluntarily chose to go?" 𝗕𝗫 gaped, leaning over the table as he squinted his eyes at Izuku as if he was lying. Why would he do such a thing? Why wouldn't he? Izuku defended. 𝗕𝗫 sat back against his own chair, arms crossed over his chest as he said thoughtfully, "He was definitely different the other day, but I had assumed it was because of the situation I had caused. Perhaps it wasn't the situation, though. It's possible that he is now a different yokai than the one I knew 20 years ago, and very different than he was as a wild kitsune, before ever becoming a familiar." Something in his tone bothered Izuku, made his stomach churn uncomfortably, and made him feel the need to defend his friend. He stood up, offering to take 𝗕𝗫's empty bowl to the kitchen. Rather than wait, the yokai followed Izuku, making him feel all the more nervous. He bit his lip. He was curious about what 𝗕𝗫 meant, but part of him hesitated to ask. It didn't sound like 𝗕𝗫 had good things to say after all, based off of his skepticism when he'd found out Shouto was helping Izuku on his own accord. "Izuku," 𝗕𝗫 said, his voice careful and gentle. "Are you alright? You look conflicted, and you're mumbling." "Oh." Izuku chuckled to himself in embarrassment, cheeks rosy as he quickly finished washing the bowls and then led 𝗕𝗫 out to the living room couches. They sat a comfortable distance apart, 𝗕𝗫 sitting straight and propped while Izuku let himself sink into the comfort of the couch. "I was wondering," Izuku began, fiddling with his fingers uneasily, "what exactly was Shouto like before I was the land god?" The rabbit yokai looked up in thought, considering his words before responding. Izuku took the time to quietly observe 𝗕𝗫. He wore a simple navy and silver kimono, yet upon closer inspection Izuku could see the quality of the fabrics, reminding him somewhat of Kami's. He wondered if she made it, as the sheen and movement of it was very similar to hers, just much less flashy. The sleeves were rolled up to his shoulders, showing off 𝗕𝗫's large and muscular arms, while the neckline was higher and flattering to his strong jaw shape. Izuku looked down at his own outfit, a pair of sweatpants and a white shirt he'd stolen from Shouto's drawer of human clothes, as he'd called it. It was slightly tight on Izuku, but then too long on him as it was better fit to Shouto's slender, toned body. He felt suddenly self-conscious. He certainly didn't look the part of a god, even if 𝗕𝗫 supposedly accepted him as such now. Part of him considered getting up to change, when 𝗕𝗫 began to speak. "I'm not sure how much you know of Shouto's history, or the history of his family. I didn't actually meet him until he was Momo-sama's familiar, so what I know may not even be entirely correct, but it's what I've heard from my parents and past brother, and I trust their information." At the mention of his family, he held his head a little higher, voice fond and proud. "Shouto's father, 𝗕𝗫. is a highly feared and respected yokai. His actions were sometimes questionable, but his status among yokai is high even to my family, and so it wasn't any of our business to intervene unless it involved us, which he never did. Besides, for his aggressive nature, he was incredibly strong, talented, and admirably ambitious. Izuku nodded his head to show he was listening, but his face dropped at the mention of Shouto's father. To hear him being called such positive traits made him feel sick, knowing the kind of monster he was and how much he'd hurt Shouto. Because of how well-known Endeavor was, Shouto was slightly famous himself. Some referred to him as the Cold Prince. They would say he was more heartless than his father, while Endeavor freely killed and tortured whoever he liked. They say Shouto would turn and pretend like nothing was happening, even when the people cried out to him and begged for his help. While Endeavor may have been selfish, he at least had some motives and gained riches from the villages he massacred, but Shouto had nothing. No feelings, no emotion, no consideration. He just stood back and watched countless die. Some say he was more frightening than Endeavor, because if you saw him that meant there was no hope. That's not 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗃 started to say, his hands in fists and his cheeks flushed angrily, but Tenya cut him off with a calm smile on his lips. I know it's not true. The first time I met Shouto was fairly soon after Momo-sama had made him her familiar. Tenya looked to the ceiling, a look of fondness in his eyes as he thought of the previous land god. She didn't even need a familiar. She worked so hard and usually preferred to do things herself. But she had said to me, "It's not so much that I need him, but I think he needs me." What was he like? Izuku asked, his previous anger calmed by Tenya's soft disposition. And what did she mean by that? Shouto Todoroki. He seemed detached, almost. His demeanor was ice cold. He didn't even speak to me the first few times I met him. Being in a room with him made you feel a little colder. It was kind of intimidating. When Momo-sama asked him to do something for her, he sometimes would refuse and she'd have to use talisman or even the familiar binding spell to make him obey her. Over time that changed slightly. He became much more obedient and loyal, but he still lacked something. Maybe you misunderstood him? Izuku mumbled. I mean, I thought Shouto was cold and a little mean when I had first met him. But I think he's just a little socially awkward, and he's only ever spoken fondly of Momo-sama. They seemed very close, from what I've heard from everyone else. Tenya laughed kindly. It's true that in the more recent years before her disappearance, the two of them grew closer. But Momo-sama had confided in me. She felt that Shouto was missing something in order to grow, to be truly happy. He frowned then, looking to his folded hands, but I've seen glimpses of Shouto from the past, when he stood by his father's side. When the rumors say Shouto Todoroki was heartless, it's hard to not believe them, so I hesitate to even think that Momo-sama's wishes for Shouto can ever actually become a reality. But he's not heartless, Izuku defended, leaning towards Tenya with fiery boldness in his voice. Shouto is kind. He's gentle and caring and probably the most considerate person I know. The rabbit yokai stared at Izuku, his mouth slightly open in surprise. He observed Izuku, the feverish flush over his scattered freckles, his wild dark curls that always made it look like he'd just gotten out of bed, the way his arms were tight and clenched all the way down to his closed fists, as if ready to fight Tenya just to prove his statement. Izuku. Tenya looked at the younger man over his glasses, his tongue quickly moistening his chapped lips before he asked, "You love Shouto Todoroki, don't you?" He remained silent, looking away from Tenya with a grimace on his face, so the yokai sighed. "You don't have to answer that, though you wear your heart on your sleeve, land god. But can I bid you some caution?" Green eyes flickered back to Tenya, though somewhat reluctantly. "I know that I'm only a human and he's a yokai, but I can't help the way I feel." "I'm not too concerned about that specifically," the rabbit yokai said, his voice louder as if to try and keep Izuku's eyes on him. "But my concern is that you're going to get yourself hurt by trying to be with someone like a yokai of the Todoroki name. I admire him, I truly do, and so it hurts me to say this, but I fear that he is incapable of loving another. Like his father, he is still a wild fox, deep down, and so I caution how much trust you put in him. You may end up burned, literally and figuratively." Before Izuku could argue back, as he so clearly wanted to do, Tenya added, "Let me show you something, 𝗧𝗂𝗧𝗏. I think it's important that you see exactly how Shouto was, long before you were born." The blue-haired yokai stood up from the couch to grab his messenger bag. Izuku watched him leave in silence, his breath held as he bit his bottom lip and sat with his fists in his lap. He was visibly upset. The things Tenya was saying about Shouto had to be wrong, and he wanted nothing more than to defend his dear friend. But he was also incredibly curious. Shouto's past was something Izuku thought of a lot, and if he was given the opportunity to learn more about it, then he was going to take it. Tenya returned shortly. Black messenger bag hung over his shoulder and across his chest, but rather than sit, he stood beside the couch, close to Izuku. Would you be willing to take me to your room, actually? You'll need to lay down in order for this to be successful. Oh. Okay. Izuku stood, leading Tenya past the dining room, down the hall, and into his bedroom. The shrine spirits came in as well, interested to see what the two men were doing. Tsuyu had her hair braided into two long pigtails, while Ochako's hair was tied up in panda buns, both cute looks that made Izuku smile, and his nerves relax just a little. He felt a little embarrassed to have Tenya in his room, as it was his personal place and he wasn't used to having others, besides Shouto and the girls in it. Tenya looked about the small room, nodding his head as if in acceptance, and then he pointed his entire hand at Izuku's bed. Please make yourself comfortable. I'll get everything set up while you just try to relax. Izuku sat himself down in the bed, moving the mess of blankets to the side so that the shrine spirits could sit by him. He observed Tenya in fascination, watching the man pull out a long mat and lay it on the hardwood floor. After carefully straightening it out, he then pulled out a shiny, silvery kettle-shaped object. It reflected the dark colors in Izuku's bedroom, its intricate braided design sparkling as it caught the little bits of light from Izuku's window and from the small lamp on his side table. The lid was decorated with delicate flower shapes, the centers of each one an actual hole in the lid. What is that, Karo? Tsuyu asked. An incense burner, right, Tenya? Ochako answered before the yokai could. Tenya nodded, removing the lid to place a small cone that he then lit, before gently closing the lid. From the center of the flowers where the holes were, little wisps of white smoke began to form and rise and slowly make its way towards Izuku. This isn't just any ordinary incense burner though, he explained, his dark eyes following the rising smoke before they flickered over to Izuku, the intensity holding his gaze. This is a time turner, a votive object, and with it I can send your soul to the past, to a time when Shouto Todoroki was not the fox that you know today. Izuku opened his mouth to respond, to ask Tenya for a further explanation. But as he inhaled to speak, he breathed in the warm, translucent smoke. It had a heavy aroma, something strong like cinnamon or nutmeg. His vision swam. He felt his body begin to sway, and before any words could come tumbling out of his mouth, the sick green-haired boy fell back into his blankets, eyes closed peacefully as he lay unconscious while his soul began to travel to the faraway past. Somehow, the main floor was even darker than the others. Shouto increased his flame, somewhat anxious about being caught with it, but also more concerned with making sure everyone was okay. As he moved silently down the halls, he felt goosebumps raising on his bare arms. He held his hand out in front of his face, using it to light the way and guide him. Approaching a utility closet at the end of the hallway, his flame flickered out completely. It took him a moment to adjust, his eyes blinking into the darkness and straining to grasp sight of anything. He reached out, fumbling for the doorknob to the closet. With a soft grunt, he pulled the door open and his eyes widened at the sight. Instead of the usual shelves lined with cleaning supplies, he found himself staring into an entrance to the spirit world. Yet right away he realized he wasn't looking at the normal main streets that he frequently visited with Izuku to get to his training dojo, but was an area of the spirit world that he usually did his best to avoid. Hesitantly, he stepped into the portal. The temperature dropped significantly as soon as he felt his feet land on the dusty dirt floor. There was trash littered about, shattered glass and the bones and scraps of some small animal scattered and stomped into the ground. It was alarmingly loud compared to the silence he had just felt back in the human world, as he could hear shouting and the bustling of a busy and chaotic city street. Shouto stood close to the wall of a brick building, listening closely as two or more drunk yokai fought over who knows what. He heard more glass shattering and approaching footsteps. Quickly and silently, as he always tended to do things, the fox yokai hurried back into the human world. Then with his right arm he conjured up a wall of ice, encasing it around the large portal. He quickly glanced around, The hallway was still without power to light it, and an aura of darkness continued to seep from the utility closet. After double-checking no one was nearby, Shouto muttered out a quick spell, then used his left hand to melt the ice, making the portal disappear with it. A large puddle of water sat at his feet, but rather than waste time using his heat to dry it, he grabbed a handful of cheap napkins from one of the shelves and tossed it onto the puddle sloppily, before hurrying out of the closet and slamming the door behind him. With the portal to the spirit world closed, already the air seemed to feel less heavy, but the creepy and eerie presence of a dark yokai remained. Shouto debated whether to hunt for the yokai or find the source of the scream. The sooner he took care of the intruder, the sooner the evil miasma would clear, but it was possible someone was already hurt or in danger. He found himself thinking of Izuku suddenly, his soft but determined face and fierce eyes whenever he felt the need to simply help someone. What would Izuku do? He thought aloud, but his feet were already moving for the large concert hall. He knew exactly what the land god would do, and that was make sure his friends were okay first. Before opening the doors, he made sure his fox ears and tail were hidden once again. Then he cautiously pushed the door open, slowly peering in. It was shadowy in the concert hall without any extra lighting, the rows and rows of black chairs making the room appear even larger and more ominous. It was almost silent, except for the sounds of a low fan, his faint footsteps, and what might possibly have been muffled but harsh, panicked breathing. Last time he'd been in this concert hall, it was when he'd helped decorate it for an event. At the time, they'd decorated it with lots of pinks and bright shades and glittery fabrics, so the almost gloomy, bland contrast between then and now left Shouto feeling hollow. That had also been the same evening Hitoshi Shinso has kidnapped Izuku. The memory made Shouto tense. His eyes flickered back to the door as he suddenly felt the impulse to hurry home to make sure Izuku was safe. But he knew he was being irrational, and instead tried to focus on the source of the heavy breathing that he could hear from somewhere close by. After looking around and still unable to figure out where the subtle sounds were coming from, he said carefully, "Hello? It's Shouto." There was a beat of silence, before a high-pitched voice wailed out, He jumped back in alarm, his eyes growing large and mouth opening wide to cry out as a bundle of pink hair came crashing into him. They stumbled clumsily to the ground, Mina practically laying on Shouto as she grabbed at his shoulders and sobbed dramatically. Unsure of what else to do, he dropped his head to the floor, staring at the ceiling while awkwardly patting her back at an attempt to console her. After another minute of loud wailing and stiff back rubs, Mina sat up, sliding off of him as she rubbed at her makeup-smudged eyes. "Aren't you going to ask what's wrong?" "Sorry," he coughed, taking the chance to stand up. "What's wrong?" She stayed on the floor until Shouto reached out and offered her his hand. The pink-haired girl took it with a slight pout, then wiggled her way closer, so that she was standing close to him. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying, and she seemed to be trembling as she held her hands to her chest. Instinctively, Shouto took a small step away from her. Besides Izuku and the shrine spirits, he wasn't quite comfortable standing so close to others. Like Izuku, though, Mina seemed to gravitate towards others, constantly touching those around her without even realizing it. There was some kind of a G-ghost. She mewled, hands coming up to her face to cover her eyes. "It chased me down the halls, down the stairs, and then when it cornered me into a closet It what?" Shouto encouraged gently, a deep frown on his face. "It freaking licked me," she sobbed, moving her hands away from her face to point at her neck. "Right here, one big sloppy lick before it laughed and then ran off, saying something about finding more delicious girlies or some shit. Was the weirdest and creepiest thing ever." Shouto grimaced. While the yokai didn't necessarily sound dangerous, it was definitely gross, and he hated creeps that treated women with such disrespect. Mina continued to cry, explaining how she hid by herself in the stadium but was unsure of where everyone else was. "Most people are working on the second floor today, so the ghost thing probably headed that way to haunt them too." She wiped at her eyes hard, her mascara running down her face and her colorful eyeshadow now smeared around. "Is this karma? I'm sorry about telling you about Izuku's crush on you. I just thought you knew and dash." "It's fine." Shouto gave her a flat smile as he quickly cut her off. He didn't want to have this conversation with her now, or ever. "I just wasn't expecting it. But it's okay, Mina. Don't tell him I told you, please." she pleaded, hands together in front of her face as she bowed low. Okay. He spent another minute helping her calm down, before seating her in a random chair and then sprinting back towards the stairway. She called out to him, but he ignored her with a wave of his hand. His ponytail came loose, his long red and white hair starting to fall down his shoulders and somewhat in the way. With a huff of irritation, he retied it into a messy bun and then dashed quickly up the cement steps of the dark, cold stairwell. The trespassing yokai wasn't something he was too concerned about anymore, but for 𝗬𝗂𝗁's sake he hoped that he'd find the damn creature first. 𝗬𝗂𝗁 knew something was up, but she didn't expect this. Running through the halls of the second floor, she came upon just about all of the janitorial staff minus their boss, Mr. Aizawa, as well as Denki and Mina. She wasn't familiar or quite comfortable with majority of them, so she didn't sit and ask them what was going on, but from the whisperings and whimpering that she heard as she passed small groups of huddled co-workers hiding together, she managed to catch little snippets here and there. Words and phrases she repeatedly heard were creepy, gross, pervert, and purple ghost. She let out a deep breath, relieved to hear that so far no one had actually been hurt, but that relief was short-lived when she suddenly found herself being pushed into a random room. It was a small office space, a wooden desk off to one side and a small, old love seat pushed against the opposite wall. There was a small green lamp sitting on top of the desk along with a vase filled with old, dying flowers and water. Her feet stumbled forward, and she cursed out just as the door slammed shut behind her. "What the foo dash," she yelled just as a hand closed over her mouth. Denki popped forward, a finger to his lips as he gently moved his hand away. He looked apologetic, wincing sheepishly as he apologized for grabbing her. His cheeks were tinted pink, and he breathed heavily as if he'd been running. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to shove you like that," he sighed, moving back to the door to press his body against it, "but there's some creepy ghost thing going after all the girls, and I saw you walking around by yourself, so I just wanted to hide you." "I'm sorry." "It's fine." 𝗬𝗂𝗁 crossed her arms over her chest, "though I don't need to hide. I can handle whatever go dash." She was cut off once again, her words stopping as they suddenly felt an ominous presence. Denki bit his lip, his face looking almost sick while 𝗬𝗂𝗁 automatically took a step back. The doorknob began to wiggle violently, its twisting and turning loud as the two held their breaths. Even as he shook in fear, Denki pushed his weight fully against the door, trying his best to hold back whatever was trying to come in. He bit his lip hard enough for it to bleed, his blonde bangs falling over his face while he closed his eyes and pushed back. 𝗬𝗂𝗁 reached out for him, but he quickly shook his head, whispering for her to hide. "Let me in." A squeaky voice rang out. "I can smell someone new, someone fresh for me to taste. It's just me in here." Denki yelled back, his voice cracking slightly. 𝗬𝗂𝗁 stared at him wide-eyed. He didn't need to try and protect her. Even though he didn't know it, she was a perfectly capable yokai able to protect herself and him, and clearly he was terrified. His face had paled more as a bead of sweat rolled down his face and onto his sharp jaw, his entire body trembling in fear, and yet he still stood between her and whatever yokai was out there. "Nope." It cried back, "I smell her, I'm coming in." Before Denki could argue, a strong force pushed the door open roughly, sending Denki forward and onto his knees. He scrambled up as dark purple smoke entered the room, blocking their vision. 𝗬𝗂𝗁's breath hitched. She told herself she wasn't afraid, but her heart began to pound violently as her vision became hazier, and the sickening presence of the yokai became almost overwhelming. She knew it was coming for her, and she tried to ready herself to attack. "I won't let you touch her." Denki screamed, and suddenly he was in front of her. She could tell by the flashes of yellow hair, bright like lightning in the darkness of the fog. She was intrigued to discover the yokai's aura diminishing just slightly. The smoke started to clear up, and there in the middle of the room stood a short, disgruntled-looking yokai. He wore a dirted, baggy dark violet kimono, and his hair was oddly shaped in multiple buns. His tan face was twisted up, a greedy smile on his lips, but sweat ran down his face as his hands reached forward hungrily. "Move away from her, human, before I lose my patience," it threatened sloppily, stepping closer to Denki who stood between 𝗬𝗂𝗁 and the yokai. "Denki, please, I don't want you to get hurt," she whispered, reaching forward to touch his back. He turned his head slightly to glance behind her for a moment, his warm golden eyes staring at her with such care and adoration that her breath hitched. "No way, 𝗬𝗂𝘁. I saw what he did to some of the other girls and I'm not letting him touch you or anyone else." "Wrong. I'm getting a taste of that sexy goth bitch." The yokai screeched, rushing at the young man. Denki's face quickly changed from an expression of fright to one of red-hot anger. The purple creature pushed off of its short, stubby legs, jumping forward to attack Denki. But the human was faster, and with a grunt he swung his leg up and kicked the yokai right between its legs, sending it flying backwards. It let out a pain sob, clutching itself while it rolled on the carpet in pitiful agony. 𝗬𝗂𝘁 gaped at Denki, before letting out a loud snort as she hurried forward and grabbed the man's arm. "Pathetic piece of shit," she spat at it as she pulled Denki along, marching towards the yokai. She stomped her heeled boot into the yokai's hand for good measure, rolling her eyes in annoyance as it wailed miserably. Its eyes rolled back, and then with a puff of the same murky purple smoke, it vanished. Denki gasped as 𝗬𝗂𝘁 pulled him past the spot where the yokai had disappeared, unfazed by its sudden disappearance. They hurried out of the room and then back into the hallway, 𝗬𝗂𝘁 moving away calmly. "You're not scared of it?" he asked her, glancing down to his arm that she was still holding on to, the color quickly returning to his face. She shrugged, stepping a little closer to Denki as they walked, her other hand coming up so that she was hugging his arm. "Nah. He was creepy as hell, but I wasn't scared. How could I be when you were there protecting me?" Her head rested against his shoulder, and she looked up at him through her dark, full lashes. The blond man gulped, Adam's apple bobbing loudly as a dark blush spread across his cheeks all the way up to his ears. He turned his head to look away quickly, but 𝗬𝗂𝘁's hand came up faster, her manicured black nails lightly gripping his face to turn it back towards her. They stopped walking, standing alone in the hall as she smirked up at him. "I don't think I did much," he muttered out, eyes wide as she let go of his chin. "Nonsense." She slid her cheek up his shoulder, bringing her face closer to his throat as she moved herself around him, so they were chest to chest, her words a warm breath on his neck. "Thanks for saving me back there, Denki." 𝗬𝗂𝘁, he whined, his red face moving down enough so he could see her a little better, but with enough space so that he wasn't quite touching her. "I feel like you're going to bite me." Her hands moved up to grab at his shirt, the fabric straining in her tightly clenched hands as she swiftly pulled him down, catching him with her lips. His eyebrows shot straight up, before he broke the kiss with a smirk, moving his lips away from hers with a loud pop as he slid them over to her cheek, wrapping his arms gently around her waist and peppering her face in little kisses. "Idiot, stop." She giggled out, pushing him away as her own face turned pink and warm, a pretty contrast to her bold, violet hair. He respectfully let go, moving his hands into the pockets of his black, torn jeans. His demeanor suddenly turned shy as he kicked at the ground and stared at his worn tennis shoes. "So I know I asked before and you said no," he said hesitantly, "but you did just kiss me, so. You want to go out this weekend? We could see a movie or something. Just the two of us? And dinner too?" His gaze moved back up to meet hers, a small sweet smile on his pink lips as he waited with hopeful eyes. She shrugged, licking her lips as she sighed. Her eyes dropped sadly. She paused, skipping her words to instead say, "I'll be busy with work a lot. I won't have as much time for you as you deserve." "That's okay," he replied right away, taking a small step closer to her. "I'm kind of a celebrity, so chances are the public will know about you. Crazy fans might hate you." "That's okay," he said again, firmer this time as he took another tiny step. "I have secrets," she whispered, looking up at him unsurely. "There's a lot you don't know about me." Denki stood in front of her, his hand coming up to brush a lock of dark hair behind her ear. "That's okay too," he said gently. "I'm okay with all of it, 𝗬𝗂𝘁. I want to someday know those things about you. He dropped his hand to take hers, sliding his fingers through hers with such gentleness that she knew he was giving her the choice to pull away, if she decided to. "I want you." Her own fingers curled around his, squeezing his hand lightly as she put her forehead against his collarbone. "Okay? Okay?" he repeated with an excited grin, bending his head forward to place a quick kiss to the top of her head. "So that's a yes then?" 𝗬𝗂𝘁 stepped back, her cheeks rosy and the shy smile on her lips, so beautiful Denki thought he could die. "It's a yes." I love horror movies. My agent doesn't allow me to eat fast food, but it's my favorite, and I'm free this Sunday. Plan around that. Awesome, he laughed. It's a date. Quick footsteps thudded down the hall as Shouto came rushing, Hanta close behind him. The two stopped in front of them, their concerned faces quickly switching to confusion. Shouto stared at 𝗬𝗂𝗁 and Denki's intertwined hands, while Hanta gave his friend a huge, questioning grin. We heard. There was a ghost? Shouto asked, his focus breaking away from their hands to blink at 𝗬𝗂𝗁 blankly. We took care of it, she replied proudly. Denki even kicked it in the balls. Got him. Hanta laughed, stepping forward to high-five Denki. Shouto gave 𝗬𝗂𝗁 a look. Are they safe now? She nodded her head, adding out loud. Nothing to worry about anymore. Denki gave her hand another squeeze before letting go, pushing Hanta back the way he came. We should tell the others and then get back to work then. Old man Aizawa will be back soon, and he isn't going to believe any of us when we tell him why we're behind on our work. The fox yokai nodded his head in understanding, then turned to follow the boys. I'll see you. He waved farewell to the Tengu woman. You too, Fox, she smiled, crossing her arms over her chest, and don't stress too much about Izuku, okay? Just do what feels right. He nodded again, his face staying straight as he turned and jogged to catch up to the human men. Do what feels right. He opened his eyes to find himself in a gathering of trees, just outside a burning village. Izuku's eyes widened and jaw dropped as he jumped to his feet and backed himself into a tree. In front of him was chaos, the dark sky lit red by the flaming destruction. He could hear screaming, crying, and his throat ached at the dryness of the air. Whatever moisture that may have existed burned away. Where am I? He asked aloud, taking unsure steps forward as he furiously blinked away his burning tears. Clearly he wasn't in the present century anymore. The architecture reminded him of old history textbooks, or even similar to the streets of the spirit world. It was hard to differentiate the sounds he was hearing, as the sound of crumbling buildings and roaring flames echoed around him. To the ground next to him sat a pile of clothing, a little dirted and worn but doable. It was perfect to disguise himself, and no one was around to claim it, so Izuku quickly unfolded the cloth to find it to be a cloak of some sort. It fit nicely over him, the hood perfectly hiding most of his face while the collar was high and went up to his nose. The most perfect part of all was that it covered his land god mark that he didn't want Shouto or any other yokai he might come across to notice. Just as he was about to leave the forest behind him in hopes of helping someone, anyone, he heard a faint cry from behind. Izuku paused, turning his head back to search for the source of the sound. Hello? He called out, moving deeper into the forest. He pushed his way through thick shrubbery and close trees, the branches of the bushes catching and ripping at his sweatpants. There was no response, so he called out a few more times as he quickened his pace, using his arms to balance himself as he climbed through forestry. A choked-out sob yelled out, "Help me, please." Izuku ran for the high voice, his heart pounding as he feared for how young the person may be. It only took him another minute, but soon he found a small child huddled on the ground, laying dirty beneath a large tree. The child couldn't be much more than 6 at most. He wore a dark gray kimono, his black hair cut short and bangs straight, and his legs covered in fresh, blistering burns. Izuku dropped to the ground, quickly reaching out for the child with trembling hands. Oh God, Izuku choked out, his hands hovering over the child as he was unsure of what to do. The Todoroki yokai, the child whimpered, reaching out to grab at Izuku. They're killing everyone. We have to go. Is there a place I can take you? He asked as he tried his best to carefully lift the child up without hurting him too much further. There's a river, the small boy pointed opposite of the village. Down that way. A cave close by. We can hide there after we cool down these burns. Izuku nodded his head, quickly getting back on his feet to run in the direction of the river. The child closed its eyes, his face and clothes covered in grime and patches of black from the smoke. He seemed to calm down considerably, as he no longer cried and just relaxed in Izuku's arms. Todoroki, Izuku thought out loud, before realization dawned on him. Was Shouto Todoroki there? The son of 𝗵𝗃𝗏? The boy replied with a furrow of his brow. Yeah, possibly. But he's always in the shadow of 𝗵𝗃𝗏, and so sometimes you can't tell if he's there or not. When Izuku didn't say anything further, The boy started to squirm a little, his tone sharp. "Why did you ask of Endeavor's son? Do you know something?" "No." Izuku quickly replied, trying to keep the boy balanced in his arms as he wiggled about uncomfortably. "I was just curious, as I've heard rumors of him. That's all." "We're almost there." The boy stopped his wiggling to point his small, frail hand up ahead, to where Izuku could just barely see a river in the distance. "Take me to soak my legs in the water." "Okay," he responded softly, alarmed by the young boy's sudden sense of authority and demanding tone. As Izuku gently sat the boy down along the edge of the river, slowly placing his legs into the cool water, the small child let out a long sigh of relief. He closed his eyes in content, letting the slow drifting water run over his burns as Izuku stood back and watched. Izuku wasn't sure what he should be doing in the past. Tenya had sent him back so quickly without much of an explanation, and while he was curious to see Shouto, he couldn't deny that he was also a little afraid of running into his father. Either way, he needed to focus as he couldn't just leave this hurt child all alone. "Where are your parents?" he asked, squatting down to sit beside the boy. "Huh?" the boy growled, opening one eye to look at Izuku with a scowl. "The hell are you talking about?" Taken aback by the change in attitude, Izuku leaned away, raising his chin to look down at the boy as he rephrased his question. Parents. Do you know where they're at?" "What the fuck are you?" The boy paused, eyes widening in shock as he looked back to his legs and then examined his own arms and the rest of his body. "Oh, right. I don't have any." Something was wrong. Izuku stood up quickly, taking a step away from the boy as he frowned. He had a bad feeling come over him, as the child seemed to act less and less like a kid. The boy glared at his movements, noticing Izuku's suspicion as he then stretched out his hands in front of him and let out an exasperated sigh. "Ugh, playtime's over, I guess," the child said, except his voice deepened and sounded like a much, much older man. Izuku turned to run, but the boy was suddenly on his feet, and then a second later right behind Izuku, small hands gripped painfully tight to his scratched-up legs. He gave Izuku a toothy grin, and then to his horror, the boy's face melted off as he transformed into a huge, red ogre like yokai. Its belly was bloated and large, and its chest broad with not muscle but fat. All it wore was a black tarnished belt-like loincloth that hung over low between his thick legs. It let go of Izuku's legs to push him to the ground, dirt and twigs scratching at the back of his neck and his bare arms. "I was hoping to find a pretty little lady, but you're pretty enough that you'll do too," the yokai leered, its dark beady black eyes blinking down at Izuku. Izuku's eyes watered in frustration as he tried to push the beast off him. He seemed to always find himself in situations like this, and he was getting really sick of it. The yokai grabbed his face, forcing Izuku to look at him. It gave Izuku a smile that made his stomach sick, as it licked its lips with a long, bumpy purple tongue. Tears rolled down the sides of Izuku's red, angry face. "Are you crying already?" "Oh, this is going to be fun." It cackled loudly as he slammed Izuku's head back into the dirt, the hood slipping off him. "Get off!" Izuku yelled, feeling his right arm warm as it glowed and surged with power as he threw his fist into the yokai's chest. The yokai flew off of him with an undignified roar, slamming hard into a large, thick tree. It slid down, landing with a loud thump as Izuku jumped off the ground and tried to flee. In a matter of seconds, the yokai was tackling him once again to the ground. This time he landed face first into the mud. Izuku yelped out in pain, his chest hurting as he was crushed by the heavy weight of the yokai. Turning his head to spit out a mouthful of dirt, he grunted with effort as he tried to get up, but the yokai held him down, much larger and heavier than the land god. "I've never seen a human with a punch like that," the yokai growled, leaning low into Izuku's face as its hot breath blew into Izuku's ear. It used one hand to hold Izuku down, his hands stuck behind his back while the yokai's other hand began to feel around, squeezing Izuku's thighs roughly and then feeling his butt. Izuku's face turned red with embarrassment and anger. He squirmed beneath the yokai, trying to shake it off to no avail. This shouldn't be happening. He needed to get away now before something worse happened. "Help!" Izuku called out desperately, hoping someone nearby could at the least distract the yokai long enough for him to get another punch or two in. "Quiet down, pretty boy." The yokai grabbed at Izuku's hair, pulling his head back harshly until he let out a miserable cry. It forced Izuku's head back into the dirt once again, making his head spin and ache. The yokai's hot, cruel hands rubbed their way down his back and stopped at the waistband of what remained of his pants. Izuku shut his eyes tight, tears falling into the muddy ground as he wished he was anywhere but there. He thought of Shouto back at home and wished more than anything that the fox yokai was there instead, touching him gently and lovingly instead of the ruthless way he was being groped now. Shouto's name fell from Izuku's lips in a breathy whisper, just as the air around them began to get very cold. Shouto Todoroki. Izuku heard the yokai gasp from behind him, instantly letting go of Izuku's pants and jumping back. The human boy quickly readjusted his pants and then scrambled up, his eyes widening at the familiar and yet strange sight of the fox yokai. He looked almost emotionless, but Izuku knew him well enough to see the anger in his eyes as he stared at the now trembling yokai. Quickly Izuku pulled his hood back over his head, trying to keep his face low as he watched in fear. Shouto stood tall, looking down at the yokai with distaste. His hair was long, flowing elegantly behind him down to the ground, his two-colored tail sweeping the ground back and forth as his right hand played with a shard of ice. His fingers danced around the ice, spinning it and making it grow larger and larger, sharper and sharper with each turn. "What are you still doing here? I thought Endeavor told you to leave?" Shouto said, still not looking at Izuku. "IW was leaving but just wanted to have some fun first. You surely know how it is, and this human boy was just so willing." "Really, we'll be going now though. Don't worry, son of Endeavor." The yokai was quivering in fear, looking back and forth from Shouto's cold face to the shard of ice in his hands. Shouto then turned to look at Izuku, his eyes so dark and lifeless. This wasn't the Shouto he knew, and something about this version of him made his heart break. It looked like he hadn't smiled in years, his face still so beautiful but so empty. "Do you want to go with him, human?" Shouto asked, sounding unconvinced. "No. Please no." Izuku stepped towards Shouto, who in reaction made his shard of ice larger and more threatening as it formed into a long spear. The fox yokai then threw the spear, sending it flying straight into the chest of the other yokai. It roared out, black blood bursting from its mouth before it collapsed to the frost-covered ground. Izuku gaped in shock, paling at the sight of the dead yokai. He looked back at Shouto with wide eyes. "You killed him so fast," Izuku cried, his hands coming to his chest as he felt sick to his stomach, so brutally. "Do you wish I hadn't?" Shouto growled, stepping towards Izuku as another ice spear began to form in his hand once again. Tenya's words began to echo in Izuku's head. If you saw him, that meant there was no hope. Izuku took a deep breath to steady himself, shivering from the freezing temperature as he then shyly glanced up at Shouto, just enough for him to see Izuku's eyes a little clearer. "Thank you for saving me." The words visibly shocked Shouto, as his eyes widened, pupils dilating and the ice spear crumbled in his hands. "What?" he choked out. "Thank you," Izuku repeated, this time looking back to the floor. "You saved me." "I didn't." Shouto shook his head, then his face regained composure, and he looked emotionless again. "Go before Endeavor finds you, and then you'll wish you'd never seen me." "I could never." Izuku quickly replied, but stopped as he was cut off by a deep voice shouting from close by. "Shoo!" The voice roared out, so loud the ground shook and the air that was once cold from Shouto's presence began to feel hot, coming at them like a wave. It reminded Izuku of the feeling of opening a hot oven and standing too close. It made his throat go dry and body want to recoil. "Go," Shouto said again, reaching for Izuku to grab him by the collar of his cloak. Izuku was too shocked and confused to fight back, so he practically let Shouto pick him up and then easily toss him into the trees as if he were a rag doll. He flew over shrubbery, the rushing wind stinging his face before he tumbled into thick bushes, the branches scratching his face and arms as he tried to brace himself for the landing. His body rolled, the wind knocking out of him as he finally landed with a heavy thud against the base of a tree. As soon as he could breathe better, he sat up from the rocks and dirt to listen closely to the exchange from a few yards away. He made sure the hood was tied tightly around him as his back rested against a tree, and he closed his eyes to listen to the voices. It was unbelievable how hot everything felt, Izuku's face dripping in sweat like he'd been out in the sun on the hottest day of summer. "You killed him," the deep voice bellowed angrily, loud stomping sounds echoing through the forest. "Yes," was Shouto's curt reply. How dare you? After I let him go with the purpose of him spreading the news. We needed him to tell other yokai about what I've done here, Shouto. Without any survivors, no one will know how great I am. There was a second of heavy silence, before Shouto said even softer, I apologize, father, it won't dash. Damn right it won't happen again. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 cut him off. There was a loud striking sound, and an agonizing cry of pain. The sounds repeated, again and again and again. Izuku slammed a hand up to his mouth to quiet himself, conceal his sobs as thick tears streamed down his cheeks as he listened to the sound of Shouto being beaten by his own father. Don't you dare go against my wishes like that again, son. 𝗕𝗏𝗏 finally said in conclusion after a few minutes that felt more like hours to Izuku. The forest suddenly silent compared to the awful sound of violence from before. Izuku turned to face the tree, his forehead pressed against the lumpy bark as he shut his eyes tight and tried to calm himself. Shouto needed help. As soon as 𝗕𝗏𝗏 left, Izuku was going to run out and help however he could. He waited, listening as the sound of the powerful yokai's footsteps faded away. Izuku was curious to see what Shouto's father looked like, but held himself back. He was smart enough to know better than to risk being seen by him. There'd been a few minutes of silence. Izuku wasn't even positive that Shouto was still there. He peeked around the tree cautiously, his heart dropping into his stomach at the sight of Shouto's crumbled form, face to the floor as his curled-up body slowly heaved with heavy, painful breaths. Izuku hurried over, only making 3 steps when suddenly the world began to move around him, everything rushing at him and blinding him all in one swift movement. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the forest but back in the familiarity of his bedroom. 3 concerned faces looked down at him. 𝗕𝗏𝗄's bottom lip was pink and swollen, his teeth gnawing on it nervously for some time as he worried over Izuku. He helped the land god sit up, while 𝗬𝗓 ran to grab him a glass of water. Ochako rubbed small, soothing circles into his back as Izuku coughed out in pain. Take it easy, 𝗕𝗏𝗄 coaxed. Time traveling is incredibly hard on the soul and body. It's important that you rest now. Izuku nodded, his head drumming with pain and his entire body aching and sore. He thanked 𝗬𝗓 for the water, gulping it down before he laid back into the comfortable blankets and closed his eyes. Did you see Master Shouto? She asked slowly, her large fingers combing through Izuku's bangs. He opened his eyes to look at them, a sad sigh leaving his mouth as he answered a quiet, "Yup, I did." 𝗕𝗏𝗄 moved to stand beside the bed, and you're wrong, Izuku said simply, looking at the ceiling as his eyes watered. He wasn't the heartless one. The rabbit yokai looked like he wanted to ask more, but Ochako shook her head. They stood back in silence looking away as Izuku covered his face, his arm hung over his eyes as he cried freely and loudly, his heart aching for Shouto and the things he'd endured in his past. It had felt like an incredibly long day for the fox yokai. He walked through the front door, dragging his feet as he took in the familiar scent of the shrine and its inhabitants, a feeling of peace coming over him. The shrine spirits greeted him softly, putting a finger to their lips to invite Shouto to stay quiet. It made his lips turn up, like he'd be anything but quiet anyways. Still, he nodded his head in understanding and slipped silently across the shrine, down the dark hallway, and to the land god's bedroom. Ochako and 𝗬𝗓 followed close behind him, but stood back in the hallway, watching from the doorway as Shouto went in to check on Izuku. He was asleep, belly down into the mattress with the blanket only covering one of his legs and his pink-tinted cheeks squished into a pillow that he was hugging beneath him. His messy dark curls haloed around his head, while his mouth was open in a small O as he snored softly. Shouto pulled the blanket up and over him, tucking it in around his back and over his arms, then sat down beside Izuku. It was hard not to smile at the peaceful young man, his long lashes twitching delicately over his freckled cheeks. Holding his breath, Shouto reached out his cool hand to feel Izuku's forehead. Shouto was thankful to find that Izuku's temperature, while still warm, was nowhere near as hot as it had been earlier that morning. He moved his hand away, trailing it down Izuku's back as he noticed the shirt that he wore was not his but in fact Shouto's. At first it had slightly annoyed Shouto to see Izuku stealing his clothes, as he had plenty of his own. But now, seeing Izuku look so comfortable in his dream-like state wearing Shouto's shirt, it made his chest feel warm in a way that probably should have been concerning. The yokai glanced back to the doorway, checking to see if the shrine spirits were still standing watching. Seeing that they weren't, he decided he would rest his eyes just for a little. He carefully lifted up the blanket, watching to make sure Izuku didn't stir too much, before he slipped into the covers beside him, a few inches of space between them. As his eyes fluttered shut, he heard Izuku stirring beside him. Warm skin hesitantly touched his arm, as if in question. When Shouto didn't move away, Izuku then wiggled his body closer, hips moving flush beside Shouto while his arms that were once wrapped around the pillow became wrapped around the yokai's thin waist. Shouto took a single deep breath, careful to keep it steady, before he opened his eyes to look down at Izuku. He was a little startled to see warm green eyes already staring up at him. "Is this okay?" he asked shyly, cheeks blossoming in more shades of pink. Shouto nodded dumbly, afraid his voice would quiver if he tried to speak. Izuku gave him a wobbly smile, his arms tightening just a little more as he nuzzled his face into Shouto's chest. He could feel his own heart beating quickly, and he wondered if he were to look in a mirror would his face be blushing? Izuku loved him. There was no denying it, as he could feel that love radiating off of him. Laying in the man's arms, he closed his eyes again to let himself feel whatever it was he was feeling. He felt the steady rise and fall of Izuku's chest pressed into him on his left, the warmth of his strong arms wrapped around him like an anchor keeping him secured. Everything felt okay, right? "I missed you," he let slip out accidentally, but didn't take it back. The words had been said and they were true. Izuku stilled, his body freezing for a moment before he lifted his head to look up at Shouto's face again, his chin resting on top of chest. "You did?" Shouto nodded, opening his left eye to glance at Izuku. But he wasn't smiling like Shouto expected. His brow furrowed and his right hand came up to wipe at Izuku's tear-filled eyes. "Why are you crying?" he asked, voice filled with concern. The green-haired man let out a small chuckle. "Sorry, I'm fine. It's just been a long day and it makes me happy that you miss me too. I'm glad you're here and safe. That's all. I always feel safe around you," the fox admitted. "Some familiar I am. I'm supposed to be the one serving and protecting you." Izuku laughed for real then, a sweet sound that made even Shouto's right side feel warm. "You're an amazing familiar, you fool. I think it's good that we can make each other feel safe. That's how friends should feel around each other." Shouto didn't miss the way Izuku hesitated on the word friends, but he didn't point it out as Izuku continued. "If anything, I feel like a lousy god sometimes. I know I'm nowhere near the level of godliness that Momo-sama was. But it's okay, I know it'll take time." Anyways, he turned his head back to its side to lay on Shouto, closing his eyes. "Stop talking and let me rest. I'm sick, you know." The fox smirked at Izuku's teasing words, knowing very well that he wasn't the chatty one of the two of them. He wasn't sure what he was going to do about their relationship, but he knew that what he wanted most of all was for Izuku to be happy. All was peaceful in the seating area of the second floor. Izuku sat on the couch, chewing away on his onigiri that Shouto had packed for him early that morning. The air conditioner purred in the background, its strong stream of cool air lovely on the back of Izuku's neck. He picked this spot for a reason, to relish in the coolness while he enjoyed his lunch and daydreamed of the yokai man that made it just for him. Shouto's hair was back to its regular shorter length, as he had insisted on cutting it a few weeks before, complaining it was too hot for it. While Shouto wasn't any less beautiful without the length, Izuku felt slightly sad by the loss. He'd kill to have hair as nice as Shouto's was. He scrolled through older pictures on his phone that he managed to take before Shouto had cut it, sighing dreamily and feeling a sad longing for the shrine where his fox familiar was waiting. Of course, the peace and silence of his break didn't last long, because there was a loud commotion of voices coming from the elevator the second the doors chimed open. "It's hot as balls out there," Denki groaned, his cheeks flushed and gray polo damp with sweat. "I'm never running errands before work for Mr. Aizawa ever again." "You're disgusting," Kyuka sighed, stepping away from him with a grimace. Denki let out a dramatic whine. "But babe, don't you think it's sexy when I'm all hot and sweaty from working out? If you call walking an extra block to get some office supplies for your boss working out," Hanta snorted. Denki looked betrayed, while Kyuka rolled her eyes and walked with a half-awake Mina down a hallway. Hanta spotted Izuku on the couch and waved to him cheerfully. Izuku swallowed his bite, then raised his arm to wave back. "You get stuck with the morning shift today?" the black-haired man asked cheekily as he approached him. Yeah, but it's not so bad. It means I get to go home before you suckers, Izuku replied back with his own grin. He liked having his evenings free at the shrine anyways. Dinner with Shouto and the shrine spirits was always pleasant, and they liked to have movie nights frequently. Denki plopped himself down beside Izuku, leaning over to take a bite of the onigiri in his hand. That's 𝗧𝗵𝗲. He swallowed the mouthful of rice, quickly correcting his speech. Lucky Izuku gets to enjoy the sunshine while we have to slave away inside all day. We should do something on a day we all have off, 𝗵𝗃 said, grabbing a plastic chair to sit across from the two boys. Like go to the beach or something. Izuku nodded eagerly, his green curls bouncing with enthusiasm. He could barely remember the last time he'd gone to the beach, as he was a pretty young child at the time. His mom was always too busy working, and he never had close friends to go out with. And with the agonizingly hot heat over the last week, as they were hitting the peak of summer, a day at the beach with his toes dipped into the cool ocean sounded delicious. I think we all have next Wednesday off actually, Denki said as he scrolled through his phone. Didn't Aizawa say something about the walls getting repainted and they wanted us out of the way? 𝗵𝗃 nodded. Oh yeah. Let's go that day. Will that work for you and Shouto, Izuku? He asked, his attention turned back to the smaller green-haired man. I think so, but I'll text you guys if it won't work out for some reason, he smiled, excitement bubbling in his stomach as he took another bite of his onigiri. He pulled out his phone again, eyes widening at the time. Oh crap. My break was supposed to end like 5 minutes ago. Izuku quickly jumped to his feet, shoving his phone back into his butt pocket of the khaki joggers he wore. He tossed the rest of his onigiri to Denki, who accepted it happily, then ran off to finish the rest of his shift. While working, he kept grinning to himself as he thought of their beach plans. It made his chest feel full that 𝗵𝗃 included him, when they really didn't have to. He knew that 𝗵𝗃, Denki, Mina, and 𝗓𝗛 had all been friends long before ever meeting Izuku, and so it made him especially grateful to be wanted with people as wonderful as them. As Izuku vacuumed the carpets, he wondered briefly if 𝗓𝗛 would be at the beach as well, and if he would then bring Prince Katsuki along. He hadn't seen the Dragon Prince or his familiar since he'd set Katsuki and 𝗓𝗛 on that date. While Shouto had been almost silent the entire walk there, Izuku was a non-stop bouncing, green-haired ball of chatter. It made a small smile creep his way onto his lips, the way the shorter man rambled on about his excitement for the beach. His hands moved animatedly, sweat from the long walk in the summer heat glistening over his skin in a way that Shouto thought really should bother him, but it didn't. Izuku made it look good somehow. It almost looked like he was sparkling, and if it weren't for the redness of his cheeks or the sudden large puff of breath he took as he complained about the heat, fanning himself with a newspaper he picked up for that purpose only, Shouto wouldn't have offered a cool hand. But alas, he was a good familiar, and he wasn't going to let his land god and best friend have a heat stroke. Oh god, that's refreshing, Izuku moaned, the noise making Shouto's own face heat up as he looked away quickly but kept his cold hand on the base of Izuku's damp neck. They took a few more steps in silence before Izuku turned, looking up at Shouto with large shining eyes and a large, sweet smile that rounded out his cheeks. Can I take advantage of you a little more? Please, came Shouto's immediate reply, his voice dry and a little desperate, before his eyes widened. Shit. He really needed to work on his filter lately. Izuku cocked his head to the side, his confused face striking the resemblance of a curious, innocent puppy. Great. Do you think with your ice powers, you could make, like, a snow cone or something? Shouto nodded his head, hoping to move past his humiliating slip-up that the dense boy had yet to comprehend. Yes. What's a snow cone? A dangerously large, excited grin spread across Izuku's freckled face. Oh my god. Show. Just you wait. He grabbed the yokai by the arm and pulled him off the main road to head to the nearest convenience store, all the while Shouto repeating in his head the sound of Izuku's delighted voice calling him Show. He soon learned that snow cones were delicious. Izuku showed him a picture on his cell phone, and after a few not super accurate but I'll still eat that ice attempts, Shouto had created what Izuku deemed as the perfect ice for a snow cone. The green-haired boy had forced Shouto to wait outside a convenience store, making him hold on to the cone-shaped paper filled with tiny chunks of ice, while he ran in to grab one more thing. It only took him a few minutes, but soon Izuku was running out with a paper bag. He eagerly pulled out a small bottle of syrupy juice, its orange color bright and artificial with a bold label that spelled out, mango. moving a little too fast. As droplets of sticky syrup fell onto Shouto's hand that held the snow cone, Izuku generously poured the syrup over the mound of ice. Orange liquid dripped from the end of the cone, but Izuku didn't seem alarmed, so Shouto waited patiently for Izuku to recap the bottle and put it away. "Mango is my favorite flavor," he smiled, bending down to take a large bite from the top. The ice crunched loudly in his mouth, his smile only widening as he closed his eyes and munched on the mouthful of juicy ice. Shouto watched, while consciously making his hand a little colder to freeze up the liquid and prevent it from dripping further. Izuku pushed Shouto's hand up towards his own face. "Now you try it." Shouto trusted Izuku's tastes, and so without hesitation he brought the snow cone to his lips, the cold, sweet ice delicious on his tongue as he let out a soft hum. Izuku bounced on his toes, gripping Shouto's arm tightly but not uncomfortably. "Good, right?" The yokai nodded, taking another bite before handing it back to Izuku. "Very." They shared the snow cone, and a few more after it, the entire walk to the beach. As soon as they passed the welcome and warning signs, the green-haired man let out a yip of excitement, kicked off his red flip-flops to instead hold them in his hand as he sprinted down the hot sand barefoot. The beach was huge, white sand stretching left and right as far he could see. The ocean water was gentle, slowly moving up and down along the shore, its blue brilliant and bright reflecting the clear sky. It was still incredibly hot out, but it suddenly didn't seem so bad with the appetizing water inviting them in. In the distance, Shouto could see familiar faces. Izuku ran ahead, waving his arm wildly as he yelled cheerful greetings to the gathering of people by a cooler, large umbrella, and spread of towels and blankets. Shouto recognized everyone there, the loud trio from work as well as Kyuka's very familiar face. What was a little more surprising to him was that Kami, Prince Katsuki, and his human boyfriend, Ijuru, were there too. Kami screeched loudly at the sight of Shouto, ditching her sunbathing spot beside the prince and his boyfriend to run past Izuku and head straight for Shouto with outstretched arms. "OMG," she giggled, squeezing Shouto's waist tight as she hugged him. "No one told me I'd be seeing your shirtless beach bod today. See, Katsuki, I told you it was a good idea to come to the beach." The dragon prince made a loud, disagreeing 𝗕𝗫𝗁 noise as he continued to slather sunblock on Ijuru's back. "Like I give a fuck about half and half's ugly-ass body. The only body I'm here to see is eyes, and anyone who tries to lay their eyes on him is going to die." "Whipped," Kami whispered loudly. "You're so sweet." The redhead crooned, leaning back to give Katsuki a quick peck on his cheek just under the large black sunglasses the blonde wore. Shouto politely pulled Kami away from him, gentle as he moved her by her bare shoulders. She wore a backless black one-piece bathing suit, the sides cut off high accentuating her hips and thighs nicely. The neckline was low, her cleavage revealing as always, especially with the way she stood always leaning forward just slightly with her hands behind her back and chest puffed out. Her cat ears and tail were gone and her makeup was more simple, much more like the current human trends than she normally had it. She skipped away to chat with Mina, the two girls immediately gossiping about probably him. Shouto would honestly rather not know the things the two women discussed. Mina wore a cute two-piece bathing suit, bright pink like her hair. The bottom was simple and high-waisted while the top was more detailed with criss-crossing strings and delicate lace. Every male that walked past the two girls ogled them shamelessly, enough to make Shouto feel a little disgusted and tempted to chuck a ball of frozen sand at them. Kyuka sat more hidden under an umbrella, a black floppy beach hat obscuring most of her head as well as the huge black frames she wore. Her swimsuit was a simple long-sleeved one-piece with a skeleton pattern on it that flattered her petite frame and accentuated her long legs. With one hand she sipped from a clear glass of soda, while her other hand rose to wave at Shouto. He waved back, then glanced over to Izuku. The green-haired man stood beside Denki and Hanta, the other two talking loudly while Izuku nodded his head and listened with a wide smile on his face. Shouto watched as his green eyes looked away, over to the couple on the towel, his expression softening. Even from a few feet away, he could tell Izuku sighed, and he wasn't sure if it was with contentment or desire. His own eyes moved away to look at the couple as well. Seeing the prince resemble a human so much was still incredibly weird for Shouto. He'd known Prince Katsuki for many years, and while they weren't at all close, He knew the prince enough to find it very hard to get used to his semi-permanent human disguise. Though despite Shouto's own discomforts, he could plainly see how happy Katsuki was. There was a softness to him that Shouto had never seen before, in the way he spoke a little more gently to Ijuru than he did anyone else. They had matching swim trunks, both red and black patterned with dramatic skulls. Katsuki was incredibly clingy to the human man, almost constantly touching him in some way. Shouto then sighed, his own chest aching with a weird feeling. He wasn't jealous. That would be inappropriate, and plus it was his own fault for not being close like that with anyone. It was not like he wanted to be like that with anyone, as he never made an effort to date and he had thought he was fine with his life as a single man. From what he'd seen, loving someone meant pain. And yet, watching the two men so clearly in love, he couldn't help looking back to the land god in front of him and wanting him more than he should. Suddenly Izuku's head turned, his eyes making contact with Shouto's. They widened in surprise, clearly shocked to find the fox yokai already looking at him. His already sun-kissed cheeks turned even more red as he gave Shouto a slightly embarrassed smile. Shouto found himself unable to prevent himself from returning a small smile back, a warm flutter in his stomach at the sight of those sweet freckles and bright green eyes. He moved forward, unzipping the light jacket he wore as he approached Izuku. "Wanna go in the water with us?" Izuku asked, tilting his head towards Denki and Hanta. "We're going to go swim really soon as Denki finishes his ice cream." "Okay," was Shouto's simple reply, and he turned away to make a spot for his clothing. He pulled off the light white jacket, neatly folding it and setting it down on Izuku's discarded backpack before he pulled off the black tank top he'd been wearing underneath. Izuku had suggested he wear the swim trunks before they got there, and now he was thankful for the suggesting as he already felt slightly embarrassed stripping like that in public, even if everyone else was doing it. Shouto looked back to Izuku, barely catching his face as the man spun around quickly, the red tips of his ears giving himself away. "You aren't going to swim in this, are you?" Shouto asked, voice soft and close to Izuku's ear as he bent down behind him, gently tugging at the man's white t-shirt. He tried to ignore the way Izuku shivered beneath him at the closeness, and tried even more to ignore how much he liked it. No. Of course not. A very red Izuku giggled sheepishly, taking a big step away from Shouto and the other two, silently observing men. Izuku clumsily grabbed at the end of his shirt, practically ripping it off of himself as he nervously pulled it off and tossed it on top of Shouto's clothes. He avoided looking at Shouto. Not that the yokai noticed too much, because he was too busy unabashedly admiring Izuku's own body. In the months they'd spent training and working out together, Izuku's body was beautifully toned, but still adorably squishy in all the perfect places. His skin was dusted in sweet brown freckles, little patches here and there that Shouto felt the need to count and touch, though of course he ignored that desire. The flustered man mumbled out something about getting a head start, then turned to flee towards the glistening ocean. Shouto's eyes followed his movements, appreciating the way the muscles in his back moved as he ran, and the round curve of his, but in the well-fitted simple, teal swim trunks he wore. One of the men behind Shouto coughed loudly, so he regrettably looked away from Izuku's distant form splashing clumsily into the water. Hanta and Denki has mischievous faces, their smiles smug as they bit their lips and wiggled their eyebrows at Shouto. Denki elbowed Shouto playfully, poking his tongue out with a wink. He ignored the will to sigh. "We saw that dude," he teased. "You want some of that Izuku booty, huh?" Shouto stiffened, his eyebrows creasing as he frowned. "What?" Hanta grinned, his large white teeth somewhat blinding in the sunshine. "Don't, what us man, we get it. Izuku's a good-looking guy. Though how about instead of window shopping you go over there and flirt with him or something? The sexual tension between you two is totally dangerous." That made both him and Denki break into laughter, while Shouto only glared harder, his skin warming with embarrassment. "You two are meddlesome." "You like us?" Denki pushed Shouto lightly in the back. "Seriously though, go join him. We'll give you guys some alone time before we follow. I'm going to see if I can convince Kyuka to get in too, anyways." The black-haired man, his smug expression still stuck to his smiling face, nodded in agreement. "I'll grab Ei and Katsuki too. I'm kinda hoping Katsuki's hot sister will play chicken with us too." Shouto could only sigh. "I'm going. And not because of anything you two are saying." "Whatever you say, man." Hanta called out, Shouto already walking away. "Breathe, breathe," the green-haired boy whispered to himself, splashing salty sea water into his face to cool himself down. He stood up to his knees in the water, gentle waves moving around him as the bright sun shined over his head. The sky was a stunning but somewhat blinding bright blue, not a cloud in sight as small birds flew around, cawing happily. It really was the perfect day for a visit to the beach, and even with his anxious heart, Izuku was really enjoying himself. Shouto, that bastard. As much as Izuku treasured every moment between them, he was getting overwhelmed again. Things were mostly normal and he was happy, but then sometimes Shouto would just say or do things that were maybe flirting, maybe not. Izuku wasn't sure and he'd rather die than ask, so he had no idea what to do. "Just breathe," he repeated to himself. "Let's just do what comes naturally." A small half-hearted chuckle slipped out as he looked down at his distorted feet beneath the water, toes wiggling in the cool, grainy sand. Yeah, right. If I did what I naturally wanted to do, then he'd probably never talk to me again. There was soft splashing sounds behind him, and he turned to smile at the yokai. His smile faded into a silent gasp, his mouth forming a small O as he took in the sight of the beautiful yokai before him. Shouto's hair almost glistened in the sunlight, the red side striking in bold while the white side seemed to sparkle as it reflected the rays of the sun and the blues of the water. While his mouth was straight, his eyes were smiling and he looked content, an expression that Izuku adored even more now after getting a glimpse of a Shouto who seemed anything but peaceful. The yokai was clearly strong. His muscular but slender figure was difficult to look away from. He wore a simple pair of navy swim trunks that really shouldn't have looked so good on anyone, yet here Izuku was speechless by the half-naked man. Shouto looked like he wanted to laugh, a tiny smirk ghosting at his lips as he stood close to Izuku. "You alright?" he asked, voice just a little louder than the soft, moving waves around them. Izuku nodded, snapping out of his trance to give Shouto a small embarrassed smile. "Yeah, sorry. You just, look nice?" He wanted to kick himself for how awkward that sounded, but still he swore he saw small patches of pink blossom on Shouto's cheeks. The yokai looked away quickly, kicking his pale legs absent-mindedly at the water as he let out a small, "Thanks. You do too." They stood in an uncomfortable silence for another minute, Izuku nervously fretting how to make things less awkward, when Shouto suddenly stiffened, frowning as he looked into the water. "Something wrong?" Izuku asked, his nerves quickly disappearing to be replaced with concern for his friend. Shouto looked back up at him, his face more confused than upset. "I suddenly have the feeling like I shouldn't be here." "What do you mean?" He took a few steps through the water to stand close enough to Shouto so he could touch his arm, the warm one, as the yokai sighed. "I don't know. I can't explain it. Do you want to go?" Izuku offered sadly. Of course he didn't want to leave, but he wasn't going to make Shouto stay if something was bothering him. Shouto smiled down at him, shaking his head quickly. No, I'm fine. I want to be here. I'm sure it's nothing." "Okay." Izuku replied, letting go of his arm to look over Shouto's shoulder. "But if you want to go, let me know and we can leave whenever, okay?" Shouto nodded again, and then turned to look where Izuku was staring. Their friends were approaching from the shore, Hanta and Ijiru running into the water with loud, boisterous splashes. The Dragon Prince stood back, his hands in his pockets as he glared at the cold water, like it might try to eat him. Mina was pulling at Kyuka's arm, dragging her into the water, while Kami was walking away, still on the dry sand with her hands behind her back as she giggled at the other girls. "I'll guard our stuff," she called out, waving as she walked back to their belongings. "Water is not my bitch." Izuku and Shouto joined the others, splashing and laughing with them as they played in the refreshing water. Being surrounded by such kind, wonderful people made Izuku's eyes water as he squealed, covering his face as Kyuka smacked another handful of water at him. Even Katsuki was smiling, yelling out profanity as he ran and pushed Denki into the water. Having friends was better than Izuku ever imagined, as he'd grown up fairly lonely most of his life. He looked over to Shouto, who was struggling to free himself from Mina's grasp as she used him to shield herself from Hanta, and hoped the yokai was feeling the same kind of joy that he was. And after getting a glimpse of Shouto's life before, he understood more now the kind of life Shouto used to live, the loneliness he must have felt, and his smile only widened. Shouto deserved this happiness and friendship that he and the others could give him. Humans are adorable, aren't they, Momo-chan? The former goddess looked away from the ocean, her dark, thick lashes blinking curiously at the blonde man. Her red lips curved into a smile as she leaned back into her chair, arms crossed over her chest. She wore a beautiful red floral summer yukata, her face protected from the sun by a parasol that leaned against the chair and shaded her pale skin. They are, she agreed, narrowing her eyes at the smiling man. What are you planning, Yuga? 𝗧𝗂𝘁𝗵𝗲, the god of beauty, flipped his shining blonde hair with a flick of his wrist. He gave a smug smirk, turning away from Momo to look back over the water and at the innocent group playing across the water. He threw off his robe, revealing his slim figure as he scandalously wore nothing but a bright purple speedo. A large jeweled belly button ring sparkled in the sunlight as he spun around dramatically. The god danced elegantly along the beach, his footsteps light as he twirled and skipped, only stopping once he reached the water's edge. I just want to have some fun, he replied innocently, hands on his hips as he pointed to the new land god's small form off in the distance. Let's see how well your replacement can swim. The god bent down to the ground, the water moving slowly and gently around his feet. He brought out one hand, then lightly flicked at the water's surface. The water rippled, a small wave moving away from him as it moved across the water, growing larger and larger, and bringing more waves along with it. It moved fast, quickly going across the patch of ocean water and turning into a giant wave that was speedily approaching the shore where Izuku, Shouto, and their friends were playing. He got up and skipped back to his chair beside Momo, leaning into one hand as he smiled up at her beneath his long blonde eyelashes. This shall be fun, she sighed, rolling her eyes as she listened to the crowd on the beach scream at the giant wave coming towards them. You're a nuisance, you know that? I was really enjoying myself watching Shouto being happy for once. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen him laugh like that before. Pardon, Momo-chan, he said, not at all apologetic. But you know I have my own duties. It's time to put the human land god to test. He heard the screams before he noticed the giant, menacing dark blue wave coming straight for them. Before Izuku could really even process it, he felt strong arms wrap themselves tightly around his waist and chest, and he was being quickly pulled towards the shore. It was a struggle to keep his eyes open as water splashed into his face, but he tried to look up at Shouto, trying to get him to let go so he could see better. What's going on? He managed to sputter out. Shouto's face was intense, a focused glare in his eyes as he glanced at the wave coming fast behind them. That's not natural. Something else is going on here and I'm getting you out of the water. But the others, Izuku gasped, trying to find his friends through the chaos of screaming people and rushing water. He spotted Katsuki and Ichiro, the two running hand in hand through the water. Hyuka, Denki, and Mina were already on the shore, calling out something Izuku couldn't hear. Shit, we're not going to make it. Shouto turned Izuku's body to hold him against his chest closer in a protective embrace, and then with his lips so close to Izuku that they brushed his ear, he yelled, "Hold your breath." He barely sucked in a large gasp of air as he felt like he'd been hit by a car, the weight and force of the waves so strong that he inhaled and began to choke. The rush of water around them, their bodies spinning underneath, was so fast and painful that Izuku was unable to tell what was going on and where the surface was. Shouto had let go of Izuku, but his hands were grasping for him, scratching at his arms in desperation. He managed to grab hold to the freckled man, holding him to his chest as he kicked off of the sandy floor they'd sunken down to and shot them straight up and out of the water. A flurry of tiny bubbles surrounded them. They both coughed and spat, Shouto's hair slicked back, revealing his face and scar more obvious than before. It looked dark in contrast to his cold, pale skin as his wet face shined in the sunlight, making him look more cool and sexy than Izuku felt was very fair. Izuku rubbed his hand along his own head to pull his bangs back so he could see better, painfully trying to blink the salt water out of his eyes. The ocean was still, just as beautiful and calm as it had been only minutes ago, as if nothing had happened. He felt two hands, one almost hot and one freezing cold, cup his face tenderly. The yokai looked over Izuku, his face fervent and a little desperate as he examined the human god in his hands. "Are you okay?" he gasped out. Izuku nodded, putting one arm around Shouto's neck for support while his other hand came up to hold on to Shouto's cold hand, boldly intertwining their fingers against his cheek. "Yeah, I'm fine. Are you okay?" "Yes," he said, more in relief to Izuku's answer than anything, a small smile ghosting his pale lips as he leaned his head forward to rest their foreheads against one another. "That was scary." Izuku laughed, eyes closing as he enjoyed the comfort of Shouto's closeness around him, the yokai's forehead both warm and cold against his own, their bodies chest to chest with loud, fast-beating hearts. It was nice, and a moment he wanted to relish in before they went back. Yeah, it was. When Izuku opened his eyes, he was a little startled by the fondness in Shouto's very close face. There was no imagining the way his eyes flickered down to Izuku's lips, the pretty pink blush forming on his cheeks, and how his tongue poked out quickly to dampen his own lips. Both faces moved closer, Izuku's breath catching in his throat as he felt the slightest brush of Shouto's nose, watched his long dark lashes flutter, close as his face tilted, their lips just a breath away. "𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧!" A desperate cry screamed out, startling Izuku and making him pull his head away from Shouto's with whiplashing speed. Knee-deep in the water was Denki and Ijiru, both boys screaming out for their friend with matching, anxious expressions. Izuku gave Shouto a worried frown, then followed the yokai as he turned away and swam to the shore until they could feel the sandy bottom. From there, they straightened up and began to run, Izuku calling out Denki's name in question. "It's 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧!" Denki yelled back at Izuku, pausing his calling while Ijiru continued to behind him. "He's gone. We don't know if he got mixed in the crowds when everyone was panicking or if he's still out there. He's always been kind of a shit swimmer." Izuku's heart dropped into his stomach at the thought of his friend possibly drowning. He spun back towards the ocean, scanning it quickly to see if he could see any sign of their black-haired friend. Just as he was about to look away, he noticed something yellow floating far off in the distance, a color similar to the swim trunks 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧 had worn that day. "I think I see him," he yelled to anyone who'd listen, instantly sprinting as fast as he could back into the water. Izuku wasn't going to wait around for anyone while his friend was possibly hurt out there. He could faintly hear Shouto from a ways off call out his name, but he didn't have time to look back and respond. As soon as the water got too deep to run in, his feet sinking into the sand and water holding his legs down and heavy, he dove in, swimming as hard and fast as he could for the bobbing yellow spot in the distance. His muscles were quickly aching, already sore from the harsh wave earlier, but he refused to slow down. With extra determination, he felt his body warm, and through the water, he could see his arms and legs glowing a faint green as he was filled with new energy and strength, his speed tripling. For a moment, he was in awe of the power surging through his body, as an excited and determined grin spread across his cheeks. His muscled arms swam hard and fast, and only a short moment later, he could see his target clearer. The smile on his face instantly vanished as soon as he realized that he was right. It was 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧, floating in the water, on his back and facing the sky. "𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧!" he screamed, quickly grabbing the skinnier man by the shoulders and pulling him up, his hair dripping wet behind him as he coughed and sputtered against Izuku's shoulder. The black-haired man looked up, his dark eyes blinking in awe at Izuku as he moaned out, "Dude, you're like, glowing? Did I die?" A large smile spread across Izuku's face in relief that their friend seemed to be just fine, his muscles relaxing and the glowing energy fading. "God no, you idiot. Why were you just floating out here?" "Didn't think I could make it if I tried," 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧 admitted bashfully, awkwardly moving himself around Izuku to hold onto his shoulders in sort of a stiff piggyback position. "I think I might have twisted my ankle really bad. It hurts like a bitch to swim with it. So I thought it would be best to wait for help." "That wave came out of nowhere, man. Like, what the hell was that?" "No idea," Izuku sighed, then proceeded to slowly swim back to shore with 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧 on his back. The mysterious wave had definitely been concerning, but for now Izuku just felt grateful that 𝗵𝗃𝗄𝗧 was mostly okay, that they all turned out okay. Denki and Shouto met the two men halfway, Denki eager to take over on carrying his friend back to the shore. Shouto and Izuku swam a little slower behind the two, some space between them as they took their time moving through the water. Izuku took frequent glances at the handsome yokai, thinking of earlier and wondering if it would be okay to try and kiss him again. Shouto seemed focused, and if anything, determined to get on to the dry beach, so Izuku put his own thoughts aside. As soon as the water was shallow enough to walk through, They stood up and softly splashed their way back to the warm, sandy shore. Izuku was slightly surprised to see how many people had come back to play on the beach, already having forgotten about the random wave that had seemingly attacked out of nowhere. Some people seemed slightly cautious, but for the most part everyone was back to enjoying themselves. Izuku stepped out of the water, turning to say something to Shouto when he noticed the yokai still a few feet back, glaring down at the water that was up to his calves. He looked like he was struggling slightly. His forehead creased in irritation as his arms were raised up and he looked as if he was trying to move forward, but his legs weren't budging. It was strange, and a little concerning. "Are you stuck?" Izuku questioned, stepping back towards Shouto as suddenly there was a bright flash of light, blinding his vision. As the light faded and his vision came back, Izuku was shocked to find himself staring at the sky. He sat up from the sand, his back uncomfortable and itchy as the sand clung to his wet skin. The sky was an odd shade of lavender, pastel and pretty but extremely unusual. Looking around, Izuku realized everyone else around him was laying in the sand just like he'd been. Even those who had been playing in the water now lay unconscious in the sand just along the shore, their faces peaceful as if they were sleeping pleasantly. He felt anxious, his stomach knotting with worry. "What the fuck, shitty hair?" Izuku turned around, surprised to see Prince Katsuki, seemingly unaffected by whatever sleeping spell had occurred. Katsuki stood on his knees, shaking Ijuru by the shoulders as the red-haired man remained dead asleep. Kami was beside him, also awake as she looked over in worry at Mina and Hanta. Kyuka stood up, Denki asleep at her feet, as she hurried her way over to Izuku. "The yokai are unaffected, it seems," she said to him, looking around with a deep frown. "And you, as a god, where'd your boyfriend go?" "He's not my 𝗧𝗪𝗧𝗃 started to sputter, before his eyes widened and he looked around frantically. "Wait, you're right. He was in the water right before that flash went off." Just then, there was a loud cracking sound as a small glacier of ice rose out of the water, Shouto on top with his ears and tail sticking out, his right arm encased in ice as his glacier rose higher and higher. He jumped off, making a patch of ice on top of the water for him to land on. A second later, something else came splashing out of the water, a fast blur of glowing electric blue, and the swish of a long dolphin-like mermaid tail with dark blue striped wrapping around it. Connected to the tail was a beautiful naked woman, her skin a porcelain white until it blended into the teal blues of her tail from the waist down, and her long pale blue hair moving elegantly behind her as she swam after Shouto. She had on her head a single spiraled horn that glowed white. A beam of light that spiraled out shot out from the top of the horn straight at Shouto, the spiral encasing him and trapping him like rope as he fell and slammed into his own ice painfully hard. Kami held the Dragon Prince back as he cursed, ready to charge into the water, her own ears and tail appearing as she created an illusion of smoke to trap Katsuki in. Kyuka's gorgeous wings spread from her back as she flew into the air, diving down to try and grab for Shouto before the fish woman could. Izuku himself was sprinting into the water, his legs glowing as he dove in and swam for the fox yokai. Kyuka landed smoothly on the ice, bending down to grab Shouto when there was a huge, loud splash behind her, and a dark purple tentacle rose out, wrapping around Kyuka's waist and flinging her away from Shouto. She screamed out in alarm, barely flapping her wings in time before she fell hard into the water. With an angry cry, she dove back for Shouto, swiftly flying around the tentacle when another one popped out and grabbed her again, this time sticking to her skin and holding her in a tight grip. Izuku reached the ice just as the fish woman did. She looked at Izuku in sincere surprise and then shot a spiral ray at him as well, before she grabbed Izuku roughly by the shoulder and slammed him on the ice next to a struggling Shouto. "What are you doing?" he gasped out, his body squirming but unable to break free from the hot but not painful spiral that wrapped around him. "Me." She blinked at him in shock, her arms resting on the edge of the ice. "What are you doing, human man? You should be asleep like the others." She looked up at Kyuka, who was kicking her legs, stuck in the tentacle's grasp. "And you too. Why are you all awake?" "Because they're yokai Hato. And that green-haired man is human, but it appears he has the mark of the land god." The voice was soft, almost timid, and Izuku was unable to tell where it came from. Hato, the fish woman, seemed unsurprised by the mysterious voice though as she nodded in excitement. "Oh, I've heard of you then. So you're the human land god who replaced Momo-sama. You're cuter than I expected, though still a little plain-looking. What's it like being a god, human man? Before Izuku could even reply, his face twisted in confusion by the woman's unthreatening demeanor despite the current situation. She continued on, and my goodness, why are there so many yokai here? Shouto, did you plan this? Did you expect all these yokai to protect you while you foolishly came back here? She giggled, swimming around the ice to peer at Shouto's angry face. What were you thinking showing up here like this? We told you we'd imprison you as soon as you even tried to take a step into our ocean. The fox yokai only glared back at her sweetly smiling face. Growling out, he said, I don't know what you're talking about, or who the hell you are. I've never even met you before. It was a little frightening how fast her smile vanished, her lips instead replacing it with a disgusted grimace. There was another loud splash from behind her, a third tentacle raising out to grab Shouto roughly, raising him into the air and dangling him upside down. Izuku looked at Shouto in worry, desperate to help him but unsure what to do about the fish woman and the mysterious tentacled creature. The same timid voice from earlier spoke out again, this time a little louder and clearly angry. Do you think you're funny, Shouto Todoroki? Is this all some kind of sick joke to you? I don't know what you're talking about. His voice raised in frustration, ice forming over the tentacle's skin, but its grip on Shouto only tightened, making him wince. You're telling me that you don't remember ruining our husband? Hato grinned, her eyes wide and scary as her tone did not match the unnatural expression on her face. How you stole his eye and with it all of his power. I haven't stolen anything. Shouto cried out, his eyes shut in pain as the tentacle continued to tighten around him. Let's talk this through, Izuku begged, frantically looking from Hato to Shouto. There's got to be some kind of misunderstanding. Silence, land god. This doesn't involve you. The mysterious voice choked out, its voice sounding more hurt than threatening. We're taking Shouto Todoroki prison, and hope you and the rest of your yokai and human friends have a peaceful day. With that, the tentacle holding on to Shouto dropped back into the water, while the other tentacle released 𝗘𝗁𝗃 from its hold. Where are you taking him? 𝗘𝗁𝗃 demanded, dropping herself beside Izuku as she glared at Hato. He felt better with her beside him. To our prison where he can rot away, Hato smiled, her hair falling forward to cover her breasts as her pretty face rested in her hand. That's what a thief deserves after all. Izuku awkwardly sat up, his body still constricted by her glowing spiral. Please give him back. He doesn't even know you. He was confused, but also starting to feel a little angry. Shouto didn't seem like the kind of person who would go and steal something from a powerful king, and Izuku knew Shouto wasn't lying when he'd said he had no idea who these yokai were. That's not true, she shook her head. 316 years ago, Shouto Todoroki came to our ocean, visited our kingdom, and then attacked our husband, stealing his eye and with it all of his powers. Do you know what that's like? Izuku shook his head, grimacing at her mocking tone, and so she continued, King Midoriya was the most powerful yokai in the entire ocean, and now he's one of the weakest. He's still a goddamn amazing king, but he's powerless now. We lost the respect of over half the ocean. 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗍 and I are strong, but we're not meant to be rulers. Her eyes watered as she continued. As Shouto left with his eye, we warned him that if he ever showed up in our waters again, we'd imprison him for the rest of his life. And still he comes here, pretending he did nothing wrong. What if I get it back? Izuku offered, leaning his body forward to be closer to the crying fish woman. If I bring back King Midoriya's eye, will you let Shouto go? Hato laughed, her bright blue eyes closing as she grinned and giggled like Izuku had told her the funniest joke. That was over 300 years ago. You think you can find it? Sure. Bring back the eye and you'll have your fox back. 𝗘𝗁𝗃 looked at Izuku unsurely, but he only nodded his head confidently. It's a deal then. I'll bring you the king's eye and you'll release Shouto. The fish woman brought up a hand, her fingers wiggling as she released the glowing coil around it. It's a deal. I'll give you 3 days, land god. If you don't bring it back by then, our deal is over. With one last sickeningly sweet smile and a wink, she flipped backwards into the water, her large fish tail smacking the water and splashing it into Izuku and 𝗘𝗁𝗃's faces. The sky began to quickly turn back to the bright, happy shade of blue that it was before. Along the beach, people began to wake up from their slumber. Kami packed up her bags, while Katsuki marched over to meet Izuku and 𝗘𝗁𝗃 on the shore. You don't know what you're dealing with here, land god. He spat, muscled arms crossed over his chest as he glared at Izuku. You just met two of the big three. They're the strongest yokai in the ocean and stronger than most land or air yokai as well, and they're not the kind of people you want to have as enemies. I have to save him, Prince. Izuku huffed back. I can't just let him die out there in some cell under the ocean. It's his own fault. Who the fuck does he think he is, stealing King Mirio's eye? I knew the fucker lost all his power, but I didn't realize it was your shitty fox's damn fault. His ass deserves to be in fish jail for pulling a stupid move like that. He doesn't even remember doing it. Izuku yelled, before 𝗂𝘁𝗁 put a hand on his shoulder, and his voice lowered. There's more going on here, okay? And I'm going to figure it out and save him. Good fucking luck, Katsuki whispered, glancing back over his shoulder to see Ijuru coming their way. Don't get yourself killed, okay? Yeah, I want you to come to our wedding, and I don't want to disappoint him. You're getting married. 𝗂𝘁𝗁 gasped, while Izuku's own mouth dropped in surprise. Katsuki, don't be telling people that. Ijuru grinned, sharp white teeth bright in the sun as he wrapped an arm around Katsuki's shoulders. We don't actually have anything planned yet, and I haven't proposed yet. It's just something we talked about the other day. For fun. Izuku gave them a sad smile. That's great still. I'm looking forward to the official announcement. Ijuru's smile dropped, and he looked around quickly before looking back to Izuku. Where'd your boy go, man? He was here just a minute ago, right? Izuku gave 𝗂𝘁𝗁 a nervous glance before he looked back to Ijuru and shrugged. He wasn't feeling good. So he left. I'm actually gonna head out too. We should also get out of here, Katsuki said, already pulling Ijuru away with him. I'm sick of all this sand up my ass. They watched the two march back up the beach, before 𝗂𝘁𝗁 gave a sad sigh. What's your plan, Izuku? He looked down at his feet, his fists clenched as he held back tears. I don't know. But I think I at least know where to start. She put both hands on his shoulders, turning him to face her. Hey, chin up, land god. You're strong, okay? And if anyone can find the eye of a sea king that's been missing for 300 years, it'll be you. Thanks, he smiled softly, wiping the tears from his eyes. I'm going to get going, I don't have much time. I'll let the others know you're leaving, okay? She gave him a reassuring smile before dropping her hands. Good luck, Izuku. So what you're telling me is that Shouto stole the great and powerful Sea King's eye, but you're still going to remove him from their prison. Tenya's expression had rapidly changed throughout the 10 minutes it took for Izuku to try to explain everything that had happened at the beach. Now he looked both confused and aghast, his bottom lip tugging in frustration between his teeth as his furrowed eyebrows bore into dark eyes that blinked at Izuku quickly. Izuku sighed, running his hands through his hair and made it messier than it already was. As soon as he'd made it home to the shrine, he explained to the shrine spirits what happened, and then Ochako immediately contacted Tenya. He showed up almost right away, out of breath and concerned, his hastiness almost amusing and considerate enough to make Izuku laugh a little. He claims he didn't do it, and so maybe he just forgot. Izuku groaned, leaning back into the sofa. I don't know. Everything's really confusing and we're missing a lot of information here. All I do know is that I have 3 days to find this missing eye, otherwise Shouto will spend the rest of his life trapped down there, and I can't let that happen. Tenya rubbed his chin in thought. His elbows rested on his knees as he let out a long breath. I'm assuming you needed to use the time turner then? Izuku nodded, fluffy curls bouncing quickly as he gave Tenya a pleading look. Please, if I can. My plan is to go back in time, see what Shouto did with the eye after he stole, and then retrieve it and bring it back. The rabbit yokai shook his head, frown deepening even more. No, that won't be possible. You can bring items into the past, but you can't take things back with you. I don't know why that is, but as inconvenient as it is, that's just the way things are. Okay. Izuku looked around the room in rapid thought before he yelled out. Okay. What if I go back, see what he did with the eye, and then come back to the present, and then go to that spot to get it? That's assuming that Shouto took it somewhere that could be attainable for you now, and that it's still there after 300 years? Your plan feels very improbable, Izuku. I don't think there's many other options, Kero. Tsuyu spoke out from beside Izuku. Tenya rubbed at the bridge of his nose, just beneath his glasses, the stress of the situation getting to him too. Fine. I just hope you're able to find some answers, as you don't have much time, Izuku, and I'd hate to see you without your familiar. The land god stood up quickly, leaning towards Tenya, who sat in a chair to the side of him, and grabbed his hands, squeezing them gently. "Thank you, Tenya. Really, thank you so much. You're the best. I'm going to get ready. Give me like 10 minutes. He hurried out of the room, leaving the rabbit yokai blushing in his seat, his face a little shocked. 𝗬𝗠 smirked, hopping after Izuku to assist him while Ochako giggled and sat beside Tenya. "His smile is like the sun, isn't it?" she said sweetly. Tenya gulped, a small smile on his own lips as his cheeks cooled. "Most definitely. I'm beginning to understand why Shouto softened up so much." 𝗬𝗠 tilted her head, large black eyes blinking in interest as she watched Izuku. "Why are doing this exactly?" "I don't want to be recognized if he sees me. It could mess with time too much, you know?" Izuku glanced away from the mirror to answer for a moment before turning back to it. "So I have to kind of make a disguise. I wasn't prepared last time and Shouto almost saw me." She nodded her head in agreement, continuing to stare blatantly at him. "If I may, Izuku, can I assist you? Because right now your disguise is quite awful." He paused, his hand hovering over his head as he was attempting to clip back his bangs. 𝗬𝗠 was right. If anything, his disguise was just revealing his face more, which wasn't going to be helpful. She hopped onto the bathroom sink, crouching on the rim as she reached for Izuku's hands to lower them. Izuku gave her a sheepish smile, a soft embarrassed flush on his cheeks as he nodded his head in acceptance. "Ochako-chan and I play with makeup sometimes," she said, pulling out a small bag from behind the mirror's cabinet, "so I think I've gotten decent at it. Karo, if you don't mind wearing some?" "I don't mind," Izuku grinned, turning to the shrine spirit to give her easier access to his face. She quickly went to work, first wetting a soft makeup sponge and then laying down a layer of foundation. After putting a little extra on his cheeks, she added some concealer to really hide his trademark freckles. With a fine brush, she thickened up his eyebrows, darkening them to appear more black than they were. Her tongue poked out of her mouth as she concentrated, her focused expression making Izuku giggle. "Stop moving," she glared, one of her hands coming up to hold his face still. "I'm going to add some thick eyeliner to sort of change the shape of your eyes, so I need to be precise." He hummed, focusing on a corner of the room to keep still as he held his breath and felt the soft tip of the eyeliner pen move around his eyes. She added a little brown eyeshadow under his eyes a bit for extra depth, and then contoured his nose to appear a little thinner than it actually was. Then, to Izuku's slight horror, she hawked up a big glob of spit right into the palm of her hand before directly smothering it into Izuku's hair. "𝗬𝗠," he cried, attempting to pull away, but she only shook her head and held him in place. "I'm styling your hair and my spit is better than any of your silly dinky human hair products. Thank you very much." That made him snort, his tense posture relaxing as he tried to not think about the spit in his hair and instead focused on the pleasant feeling of her fingers running through his hair. She continued for another minute, pulling his hair this way and that, before she finally clapped her hands together and beamed. "Nice," she said to herself more than to Izuku, and then she turned him to face the mirror. Izuku gaped, the person in front of him not at all what he was expecting to see. 𝗬𝗠 had done an amazing job with the makeup, and the hair is what really made him look entirely different. His skin was clear and bright, not a freckle or blemish in sight. She made his nose look thinner and longer, while his eyebrows were fuller and longer, making his usually baby face appear a little more mature. The green-haired man leaned closer to the mirror, admiring his own eyes. They looked sharp, almost mysterious with the thick liner, and while it darkened his eyes quite a bit, the look was exciting and definitely not very him, which he was pleased about. His hair was also very different from its usual array of curls and fluffiness. 𝗬𝗠 had straightened out his hair, pulling his bangs down and to the side so they covered most of his right eye as well as the land god mark beneath his forehead, while she also spiked up the back of his hair in an almost faux hawk style. With it gelled up, the color of his hair appeared darker, almost black even, and really completed the whole look. Izuku stared at his reflection in awe, a hand coming up to his chin as he angled his face in different ways for different views. "𝗬𝗠-chan, you're incredible." He beamed at her, his large charismatic smile still the same as it always was. She huffed out a small laugh and teasingly said, "I know. Now don't go smiling like that while you're in the past, or Shouto will recognize you for sure." With one last look in the mirror, Izuku got up to change his clothes. He didn't want to stand out, So with Tsuyu's help he dressed into a simple maroon yukata, one that was a little worn and wouldn't catch anyone's eyes. His stomach began to churn with nervousness. Shouto in the past was definitely nerve-wracking, and he was scared to see why exactly the fox yokai had gone and stolen the eye of the great Sea King. The green-haired shrine spirit noticed his grimacing expression and reached out to touch his hand. "Be brave, 𝗧𝗵𝗲," she said tenderly, adding the honorific with a gentle and respectful tone. "We should hurry. You need to save Master Shouto." He nodded his head, giving her hand a grateful squeeze as they hurried back out to Tenya and Ochako. It was time for Izuku to go back in time again. Shouto sat with his back against the cold, rocky wall, the barnacled texture at first unpleasant, but now unnoticeable as he glared into the dark cell. The single door keeping him in was locked and impossible on his own to break, and the only source of light was through the tiny window at the top of it. He was grateful the Sea King's kingdom wasn't filled with water. Like Shinso Hitoshi's shrine, it seemed to be preserved in some kind of protective bubble. So he breathed evenly and mostly comfortably despite the harsh cool air in the cell, his left side keeping his temperature at a comfortable level. Like earlier, he was still only wearing a pair of swim trunks, so he felt a little awkward and stiff being half naked in such an unfamiliar place. After what must have been several hours, he heard light footsteps approaching. He stayed seated, but lifted his head to see the fish-tailed woman peering at him with a single eye through the tiny window. Her visible eye widened when she saw Shouto looking at her, and with a slight squeal she swung open the door. She stood on bare legs, entirely nude and her more personal areas only covered by her long bright blue hair that hung around her. Shouto had to resist grimacing or looking away, as to not want to offend her in any way. "You have legs?" he ended up asking, his voice rather emotionless despite his genuine curiosity. She stuck out a leg to show proudly, dragging a single finger from her knee to her thigh in a somewhat seductive gesture, her hair somehow moving with her to keep her crotch and breasts covered. "Yes. Aren't they beautiful? 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗍𝗂 made them for me, since Mirio couldn't since you took his powers and all. Don't you remember when we first met and how I was like so small? My fishtail was like minuscule." He opened his mouth to respond, eyebrows furrowed in confusion, but she continued talking before he had the chance. And despite his loss of power, Mirio is still so strong. So don't think you've beaten us yet, Shouto Todoroki. Even missing an eye, he's still amazing. I don't know you. He frowned, standing up to approach her, or this 𝗵𝗃𝗁𝗍𝗂 or Mirio that you speak of. She stood taller, her height just slightly above his as he stopped and stood next to her by the door. "Yes, you do. We met 316 years ago when you ruined Mirio. Your hair was way longer then. Why'd you cut it? It was cute. Anyways, even if you hadn't come and ruined everything, you should still know who I am." She barely paused to breath as she bounced around on her bare tippy toes. "Surely you've heard of me, the beautiful goddess 𝗳𝗏𝗎𝗍. Once a goddess on land for the lovely humans who abandoned me, and now a goddess of the sea for the fish who will always appreciate me. 𝗳𝗏𝗎𝗍." The name was familiar, and Shouto suddenly remembered a conversation he'd had with Izuku the evening after the land god had been kidnapped by the snake yokai Hitoshi Shinso. "I kind of feel bad, to be honest," Izuku said, looking up from his bowl of soba noodles. "About what?" Shouto asked, though he had a feeling he knew what or who Izuku was talking about. Hitoshi, the green-haired man, mumbled as he chewed, then swallowed. "I'm not justifying anything he did. Obviously I'm not okay with anything that happened, but I still feel a little bad for him." Shouto sat down his chopsticks, his tone going cold as he replied a little more sharply than he'd meant to. "Why?" Pink dusted Izuku's cheeks as he looked away in embarrassment. "It's just, he was really lonely. He said that he was a familiar like you, before the goddess he served passed on into a tree. And that's why he took me, because he said his lady Nijier had told him to find a companion." When Shouto didn't reply right away, as he was too busy thinking back to when he'd been alone in the shrine, Izuku continued talking, and honestly, when he wasn't being so pushy, he seemed kinda nice. "It sucks honestly that we couldn't have just been like normal friends or something. You're still considering friendship with that snake?" Shouto could hardly believe what he was hearing. Izuku shrugged. "I mean, yeah, maybe. If he apologized properly, then I don't see why not." Shouto watched as Izuku went back to eating, The way his eyes smiled even when he wasn't speaking, how his large and strong hands held the chopsticks almost gently. Everything he did was with gentleness. Izuku exuberated nothing but kindness, even when others had wronged him so badly. Even when Shouto had first met him and been rude and bitter with him, the young man was always nice. He couldn't help the small sigh that escaped his lips. He wasn't even sure why he made the oddly satisfied sound. "You're too kind, 𝗧𝗂𝘁𝗵𝐴𝑐𝗿." Shouto felt himself smiling as Izuku looked up at him with large, surprised eyes. The man grinned, his smile so large his eyes almost closed. "You can never be too kind, Shouto." "𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏?" Shouto's ears twitched on his head, as he remembered what Izuku had told him about the snake familiar who'd kidnapped him months before, as in Lady 𝗵𝗃𝗧𝗏 of Hitoshi Shinsu's shrine. Her entire disposition changed at the mention of the snake yokai, the bounce in her toes relaxing as she took another step into the cell to close the door behind her. "You know my Hitoshi?" she asked softly, tilting her face closer to Shouto's. While a little bothered by her closeness, he didn't step away. He tried to kidnap the god I serve. Then he tried to force him into marriage because he's lonely since you had apparently turned your body into a tree to rest in peace. Hato seemed unfazed by his harsh tone, the small smile on her pink lips only broadening. "He did that? Oh, that silly snake. That's not what I meant when I told him to find love. So you're not a dead tree then." She let out a small laugh at that, patting Shouto on the head as if he were a dog. "Dead? No. I was a powerful and very pure goddess, Shouto. Despite growing old and my powers weakening, I could never vanish just like that. My soul was simply reincarnated." The woman held out her hand, revealing in her palm a small white pearl, similar in color and texture to the spiraled horn on her head. "When Mirio and Amajiki found me, I was just a tiny pearl like this. They helped me grow stronger. Mirio recognized my potential to once again be a strong goddess. And he even gave me this horn." Shouto nodded in understanding. His knowledge on reincarnation was definitely lacking, as he'd never knowingly met any reincarnated yokai. The face of his mother, when she was alive and healthy, filled his thoughts, and he considered her. "Are all yokai reincarnated?" he asked quietly, a little embarrassed to ask a question he should probably know the answer to. "You don't know?" she replied loudly, voice echoing in the cell. "Didn't your father teach you anything? You were raised by Endeavor, so how could you not know?" His fists tightened and his face visibly darkened in anger at the mention of his father, but Hato only waved her hand in front of her face to move on. "Well, anyways, I mean no one really knows everything about it anyways. Even to yokai, reincarnation is a mysterious thing. It seems like if you're murdered or die of illness, then you won't be reincarnated, and if your soul is trapped anywhere, then you also won't be reincarnated. Free, beautiful spirits like me -- she flicked her hair dramatically over her shoulder, revealing one of her breasts -- get to be reincarnated." She spun, her hair flowing around her and then falling back in place. "So you've met my Hitoshi? I really miss him. I was hoping he'd moved on from our shrine, but that doesn't seem to be the case." "No, it isn't the case." Shouto grimaced, then turned to sit back against the bumpy wall. He was irritated and done with the hyper woman, but she seemed eager to continue chatting. "So he fancied your land god?" she squealed, squatting down in front of Shouto to be eye level with him. "That's the green-haired human boy, right? Did he like Hitoshi back?" The thought of Izuku actually having any interest in Hitoshi back made Shouto feel even more frustrated. He could feel his right side growing colder, a small layer of ice forming on his jaw and neck as he inched himself away from Hato. This woman was testing his patience, and he had absolutely no interest in talking about the sleazy snake yokai, especially if the conversation involved Izuku too. "Touchy subject?" she asked with wide innocent eyes. "Are you jealous, Shouto? I know Hitoshi was sometimes fond of me. Familiars are like that, you know. It's okay to be attracted to the god you're serving. But it's good too. I mean, Hitoshi was able to help some of my sexual frustrations. Have you and Izuku done any -- Stop!" Shouto snapped, covering his ears as he did not want to hear about the kind of relationship she had with her ex-familiar. "I don't need to hear this, and no, I am not jealous. Izuku just has no interest in that damn snake, okay? So grumpy." She pouted, standing up and moving back to the door. The fox yokai only glared, growling out, "Why did you even come in here?" She shrugged, putting a hand on the door. I was bored and wanted to make sure you weren't enjoying yourself in here too much. You are a prisoner after all. Her hand froze, her face turning away from Shouto quickly to examine the door. She looked up and down, stepping back to look around more, and then let out an exasperated sigh. Shouto almost smirked, realizing the woman's mistake just as she did. Except then he frowned, realizing what it meant for him. I'm stuck in here, she whined, banging her fists on the door. With me? Great, Shouto deadpanned, leaning forward to put his head between his knees to block out the loud banging that echoed in the cell. I am mad, she yelled out, her voice loud enough to shake the walls of the tiny cell, the vibrations rumbling the floor and making Shouto's stomach flip. There was the sound of hurried steps approaching the door and then silence, before a soft voice, the same one Shouto heard back when he was trapped by Heido's spiral and the tentacle arm, stammered out, Heido? Are you in there with the fox yokai? Yes, she wailed, hitting her fists against the door again. Can you let me out, babe? There was a long, heavy sigh before the door swung open. You're an idiot. Heido grinned happily, skipping forward to wrap her arms around the shoulders of a nervous-looking yokai. He was still tall despite the way he stood hunched over slightly, as if he was feeling uncertain about where he stood. His lips wobbled anxiously, his cheeks turning pink as the naked woman peppered them in grateful kisses. The yokai had black hair, his long bangs hanging over his face while long pointed elf-like ears poked out the side of his head through his straight hair that stuck out in the back. He stood in an elegant kimono, the fabric a shimmery shade of dark violet that almost appeared black. Scattered along it were golden flowers and leaves, the entire thing beautiful and striking against the yokai's pale skin. It was the kind of kimono someone of proud royalty wore, so Shouto found it strange to see such a nervous-looking man wearing something so extravagant. 𝗵𝗃𝗁 wouldn't even look up at him, his head slightly lowered and gaze intense on the ground. As 𝗵𝗃𝗁 began to pull the door closed, Shouto jumped up. Wait, you need to let me out of here. For someone seemingly so skittish, the yokai's reflexes were incredibly sharp. As soon as Shouto stepped forward, 𝗵𝗃𝗁's hand that wasn't on the door instantly twisted and formed into a huge, long tentacle. It lashed out and struck Shouto, forcing him back and pinning him against the rocky, sharp wall. He cried out in pain, gasping for breath as he was then dropped to the cold floor, his bare back scratching painfully against the wall behind him. The tentacle shrunk down and then changed back into a hand, its owner trembling. With a quivering mouth, but fiercely angry eyes, 𝗵𝗃𝗁 finally looked up at Shouto. His small, dark eyes were cold, and with an anguished voice, he hissed out, You're going nowhere, thief. He slammed the door shut. Then he and Heido hurried away, leaving Shouto in deafening silence. His back burned. He could feel the wetness of hot blood trickling down from the fresh cuts, but instead of trying to deal with it, he just sat. The fox ears on top of his head dropped down sadly, and his tail wrapped around his bent legs. Shouto thought hard, trying to understand why the two considered him a thief. He didn't recognize them at all, nor could he picture whatever their third partner, King Mirio, looked like. They kept calling him thief, and obviously they were apprehensive about being around him, and even claimed that he stole the Sea King's eye, but he definitely had no memory of doing such a thing, and couldn't fathom why he would ever. He gritted his teeth, feeling alone and a little hopeless with no ideas on how he could escape and return to the shrine, and to Izuku. Traveling back in time was just as weird the second time as the first time. As Izuku opened his eyes, he once again felt like he was in some kind of surreal dream, and yet it was so impossibly real as he could feel the freezing cold temperature of the water that rushed around his feet. He jumped in shock, not expecting the icy water, nor expecting to find himself on a beach. Unlike earlier that day, though, the sky was a dark gray, a light foggy mist blurring his vision as he squinted at the vacant beach. It looked different, of course, as it was 3 centuries in the past, but Izuku had a strong feeling he was standing in the same beach as the one they'd visited that morning. The dry, cold sand he made his way over to wasn't much better for warmth, but he definitely preferred it over the icy cold ocean currents. He shivered, holding his arms close to his body for warmth as he quickly looked at his surroundings. Behind him, he saw the top of a grassy hill, opposite of the ocean, and atop it he saw a dark figure moving away from the beach. They walked slowly, hunched over as if in pain. The figure's pointed ears and long red and white hair and matching, dragging tail were unmistakable. 𝗕𝗁𝗧𝗵𝗲 breathed, as he then quickly followed after the yokai. Making sure to stay low, he followed 𝗕𝗁 through the tall grass and down another hill. He watched 𝗕𝗁 pause a few times, as if to catch his breath. One of the times he physically fell to his knees, and it gave Izuku just enough time to get close enough to see just how rough of a condition 𝗕𝗁 was in. It took everything in him to not rush forward and help his friend. 𝗕𝗁's hair was dripping wet and messily tangled as it hung along his back. The dark yukata he wore was also soaked, pieces of it torn and tattered. His right sleeve was entirely missing, and the exposed arm was almost purple with bruises and possibly frostbite. He sat hunched forward in the grass, breathing heavily and unevenly in a way that made Izuku's heart ache. Izuku's eyes trailed from the top of 𝗕𝗁's worn arm down to his hand, which was closed in a tight fist. His mouth opened into a small O, as he realized that 𝗕𝗁 could be holding the Sea King's eye. It would make sense if he'd just stolen it, since he looked so exhausted and injured. Izuku frowned, watching as 𝗕𝗁 got back up and continued on his way. Unfortunately, it seemed he didn't go back in time far enough to see 𝗕𝗁 actually take it, but at least he could still find out what the yokai planned to do with it. 𝗕𝗁 continued on for another 20 minutes or so, unintentionally leading Izuku down to a separate beach that was much more rocky than it was sandy. Izuku stayed back in the tall grass, crouched low as he watched 𝗕𝗁 climb through large black rocks, making his way up towards a small cave. He bit his lip in frustration. There was no way he'd be able to follow 𝗕𝗁 up those rocks without being caught, so he needed to be patient and wait. It took 𝗕𝗁 a while, but eventually the haggard fox yokai slipped his way into the cave entrance, having to duck slightly to get in. Izuku let out a loud sigh of relief, before jumping up to hurry after him. While it took 𝗕𝗁 at least 15 minutes, Izuku was able to clear the mountain of rock in less than 5, as he moved quickly and efficiently up the rocky boulders. The cave entrance was definitely small, and even he had to bend his knees just a bit to fit inside. The temperature difference from outside of the cave to inside was glaring. If Izuku thought he was cold before, then he was absolutely freezing now. He squinted into the darkness, his eyes struggling to adjust as he cautiously made his way forward. Besides the sound of his chattering teeth, he could hear a faint whistle of blowing wind and the slightest sound of voices from somewhere ahead. It felt wrong, moving forward into such blinding darkness, but he was determined, and so he continued to walk, the voices becoming more discernible as he went. A faint glowing light appeared, but it was hard for Izuku to tell if it was small or just very far away. Izuku realized quickly that it wasn't a slowly enlarging light, but a lit-up room of sorts that was growing closer. He hurried to it, then carefully peered inside. The cave chamber was huge, possibly the same floor space as the shrine. It was lit up by beautiful blue and purple crystals that stuck out of the walls, layers of ice scattered about on the floors and on the rocky walls. There were icy boulders scattered about as well, and to the far back was a large flat rock that 𝗕𝗁 knelt beside, his back to Izuku, while on it lay a figure all dressed in white. It was hard to understand what exactly 𝗕𝗁 and the person were saying, so Izuku decided he wanted to get closer. He tiptoed out, quickly and quietly sneaking from boulder to boulder, hiding behind each one as he made his way closer to the two. There was a particularly large black rock that sat just a few yards away from them, and Izuku eyed it with a mischievous grin. It would be perfect to hide behind, and close enough to get a good view and to hear their conversation better. With a long inhale of breath, he scurried over quickly to the rock and then sat back against it as he held his breath and waited. Getting this close was risky, and he didn't want to be caught. "Did you hear something?" a raspy, feminine voice asked. Izuku stiffened, his hands coming up to his chest as he wished his heart would slow down and stop beating so loud. There was another few worrisome seconds of silence before 𝗕𝗁's own voice, sounding worn and exhausted, spoke out. "I'm sure it was just the wind. There's no way anyone was able to follow me from the ocean. I made sure of it." Phew. That was close, Izuku thought to himself as he let out a shaky exhale of the breath he'd been holding in. He pulled his yukata around himself a little closer for warmth, watching the condensation leave his mouth as he breathed. His bright green eyes peeked around the rock, his focus first on 𝗕𝗁. What would he give to snuggle up with the yokai's warm side? What were you doing in the ocean, Shouto? Is this why you look so awful? I'd assumed it was your father's doing, but now I'm not so sure. The woman asked, her voice sounding concerned but also a little suspicious. Izuku looked away from Shouto to stare at her, but from his angle all he could see were thin bare legs, the fabric of a silky white kimono, and a white fluffy tail. I haven't seen father in weeks, thankfully. Shouto brought up a hand and revealed in his palm a small glowing sphere, its color a brilliant royal blue that lit up the yokai's face. I went to the ocean to obtain this for you, mother. The woman sat up with a gasp, while Izuku held in his own surprise. She was gorgeous. Even with such a shocked and almost fearful expression, the yokai woman was breathtaking. Her snowy white hair, while parts of it were silver and looked dry with age, still framed her face prettily as it hung over her shoulders. Like Shouto's right eye, both of her eyes were a golden brown, like warm honey, her expression very much resembling his as she frowned at Shouto with such passionate concern. On the top of her head, she had two small, almost rounded fox ears, one of them missing a chunk, but the wound was healed and clearly old. She brought a hand out to touch the glowing eye, before she stopped herself and pulled her own hand back harshly. Why would you take the Sea King's eye? Shouto reached out to take her hand, his red hair falling over his face and blocking it from Izuku's view as he then gently placed the eye into her palm. To save you, mother. It'll heal you. It can make you strong again. Then you can finally be free. You won't have to spend your life alone hiding in some cave. You can come with me, and I'll protect you. His voice sounded so hopeful, so earnest and innocent as she stared at her son in horrified shock. I have one question for you, Shouto, she said with grave seriousness. What is it? He asked, leaning closer to her. Izuku found himself leaning forward as well, holding his breath as he listened to hear what Shouto's mother was going to ask. She sat up straighter, now her body more visible, and Izuku could see just how thin and sick the woman was. Her small, pale hands shook, and her lips quivered as she opened them to speak. It was clear she was afraid of the question, or maybe the answer she'd receive. With her eyes wide and an intense, almost creepy expression, she whispered out the most unexpected words that made Izuku's heart drop into his stomach. Are you still in love with that human boy? Are you still in love with that human boy? Izuku's jaw dropped, not at all expecting Shouto's mother to ask her son that. He couldn't stop the pain in his chest, the instant jab of jealousy that was completely uncalled for as he wondered so many things. Past Shouto was in love with someone? And a human? Even when the Shouto he knew today was so against it, maybe it was all just an excuse because he didn't want to be with Izuku. He shook his head, clearing his thoughts. While he couldn't help himself from feeling jealous and a little hurt, he knew he was being irrational and unfair. This was a past Shouto, one that existed 300 years before he ever knew Izuku. He had the right to love whoever he wanted, even if it wasn't him. Even if it still hurt. If Shouto had found someone to make him happy, Izuku would support it the best he could. His swirling mess of thoughts stopped when he heard Shouto's stiff reply. I am. Everything about Shouto's mother changed in an instant. She carelessly tossed the eye to the side of her as a low growl bubbled in her throat. Her large white tail began to swish back and forth behind her as she jumped at Shouto, tackling him to the ground. There was a painful thud as his back hit the floor, but he held on to his mother securely, as if to soften her fall. Tears filled her eyes as she pushed away from his chest and shook him by the shoulders, a wretched sob escaping her as she cried out. I told you, Shouto. I told you to never love a human. How dare you? Don't you love me? How can you expect me to want to live if you're going to make the same foolish mistake I did? Shouto was gentle despite how violently she shook him, how her long nails dug into his wounded arms, hard enough to draw blood. He moved her up, sitting up with her as he stared at his mother with sad, caring eyes. I love you, mother. But I love him too, he paused, looking over her face in earnest. Please, let me help you get better. She staggered off of him, turning back to the rock and grabbed the glowing eye. Let me die, Shouto. Leave me. It's too late for me now, so just go ahead and ruin your life just like I did. With a heartbreaking cry, she threw the eye towards the cave's exit. It bounced loudly, sounding like hard glass as it rolled away into the darkness of the tunnel. Shouto made no move to follow it, instead trying to calm his mother. He reached out again, steadying her and running his fingers through her hair as he held her against his chest. Izuku bit his lip. He needed to follow that eye to see where it ended up, but he felt frozen, stuck watching the man he loved try to calm his sick and unstable mother. It didn't take long for her to settle down, her breathing becoming short and fast. Shouto carefully laid her back down, moving her damp hair away from her face. "I'll go get the eye, and then please, mother, take it so that you can get better." He stood up, turning to leave when she reached out quickly to grasp him by the wrist. "No, Shouto." She looked up at her son, tears trailing down her face and dripping onto the rock. Her entire disposition softened, and something in her face changed as she looked almost fearful. "Don't leave me now. If you walk away, I'll die alone." The poor yokai looked torn. He glanced back towards the tunnel and then to his mother. "But if I get it, then you won't have to dash." "Shouto," she said, more stern despite how frail her voice was getting. "It's too late now. Stay." His mismatched eyes widened in understanding, and he fell to his knees beside her. "No, mother, not now. Please. I just found you again. I can't lose you for good this time." She gave him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes, as one of her hands came up to cup his cheek tenderly. "I love you, Shouto. Please, be wiser than I ever was." Izuku watched with tear-filled eyes as her hand dropped from Shouto's face, her body going still. Shouto curled over her, clutching her still hand as he began to shake, silently sobbing. All Izuku wanted to do was run forward and wrap his arms around the grieving yokai, but he held back, his hands forming fists as he strained to stay put. He had a job to do, and after wiping the tears from his eyes and cheeks, he silently slipped out of the cavern and back to the exiting tunnel. Rather than the pitch-black darkness like before, Izuku was now able to faintly see the cave walls. Everything was lit by the bright glowing eye in the distance, as it created a blue hue over everything it lit up. Izuku ran for it, quickly bending over to scoop it up in his hands. To his surprise, it was hard and smooth like marble. He couldn't help feeling relieved that it wasn't squishy like a regular eye, just the thought made him grimace. With one last glance behind himself to make sure Shouto wasn't leaving yet, he ran down the tunnel, using the eye to light his way. Getting out was much faster than getting in, and soon Izuku found himself outside in the wind once again. It was oddly relieving, the air slightly warmer than it was inside of the cave. His nose and fingertips were numb with cold, so the warmth of the eye in his hand was appreciated, but also addictive. He carefully pocketed the eye before he made his cautious descent down the rocks and back to the main beach. There was an aura of power coming from the eye. Even from within his pocket, he could feel the energy surging through it. "Now where can I put it that'll still exist for me to find 300 years later?" Izuku asked himself out loud as he hurried through the tall grass, his eyes scanning around for any kind of ideas. He stopped on top of the hill, staring down at the dark ocean. It looked angry, the waves rolling harshly as it splashed along the shore, the layer of fog still deep over the sand. Izuku considered going to the Sea King now and just giving it back to him, but he worried over how big of an impact that would have on the present. He didn't want to change time too much. What could that do to his current self or the current Shouto that was stuck in the ocean? As he continued his walk along the beach, he noticed another small hill of rocks. He'd walked about a mile at this point, so he was far enough away that he wasn't too concerned about Shouto finding him anytime soon. As he examined the hill, he noticed another small cave entrance similar to the one that Shouto and his mother had been in. Suddenly, Izuku had an idea. With the Sea King's eye safe in his pocket, he sprinted for the mountain of rocks and then quickly climbed his way up. The rocks were more slippery here, and after slipping more times than he was comfortable with, he forced himself to slow down. He bit his lip in frustration as he carefully pulled himself up the rocks. Time was ticking. He'd been in the past far longer than he had before when he'd first time traveled, and so any minute now 𝗕𝗫 could summon him back. His body was growing heavier. He was shivering from the freezing temperature, and he could sense that soon he would need to go back to the present before he caused any serious damage to his body. Almost there. He groaned as he pulled himself up higher and higher, his numb and aching arms glowing with extra strength as he willed himself to keep moving. As soon as his knees hit a stable bottom, he pulled a talisman out of his pocket and quickly scribbled on it. His tongue poked out of his mouth as he focused, writing the words of the spell with care and precision, but also with urgency. He then crawled his way into the cave, going back as far as he could go. Once he was unable to go any further while still having space for his arms to move, he awkwardly pulled the Sea King's powerful eye out of his pocket and placed it gently on the ground. Then he pulled out his written talisman and placed it on top of the eye. As his head began to spin, the familiar sensation of going back to the present rushing over him, he read the written words out loud. Stay hidden for 300 years until Izuku Midoriya returns. I know where the eye is. Izuku was yelling before his eyes were even opened yet. Ochako and Tsuyu both rushed forward to support Izuku as he tried sitting up, blinking wearily at the soft bedroom lighting. His whole body ached. His head felt heavy and dizzy, and everything was too hot. He tried getting up, but 𝗕𝗫 stepped forward to firmly push Izuku back down on the bed. You must rest, Izuku, he demanded, his hands slicing the air as he glared. But his tone was caring. I let you stay there for far too long and your body needs to rejuvenate itself. But Shouto, Izuku whined, his limbs screaming at him to just let go and relax into the comforter. He gave in to the gentle touch of Ochako's small hands rubbing into his shoulders as he turned and lay on his stomach, the side of his face sinking into the soft pillows. 𝗕𝗫 looked stressed, his concerned frown staying on his face as he paced around the room. Tsuyu bent her face towards Izuku's, her large eyes blinking at him as she reached her hand forward to lightly poke him on the nose. You have time, Izuku. If you want to save Master Shouto, then you need your rest, Kero. We'll get the eye tomorrow, Ochako whispered sweetly as Izuku's eyes began to flutter shut. Master Shouto will be okay for another day. Get some sleep and then tomorrow you'll rescue him. Tomorrow, Izuku whispered, his voice barely a breath. I'm sorry, Shouto. I'll be there tomorrow. 𝗕𝗫 set off early the next morning. The rabbit yokai apologized profusely, but insisted he had duties he needed to attend. Izuku waved him off, hugging him and thanking him for his help. Then he and the girls left shortly after. While the shrine spirits were generally uncomfortable leaving the shrine alone and unattended, Izuku convinced the girls to come with him, as he needed their help. Ochako left a small sign at the shrine's entrance that read, Closed today. Please come back tomorrow for extra blessings. It should be fine, Oka-chan. Izuku smiled down encouragingly to the brown-haired shrine spirit. It's not like we get much visitors anyways. Some days no one even shows up. I'm not sure that's a good thing either, Tsuyu hummed thoughtfully. We should do something to help the shrine's popularity, Kero, after we get Master Shouto back. Ochako's face lit up as she clapped her hands together. Oh yes, we should have a festival. Izuku, you could perform a dance. Momo-sama used to and the people loved it. A dance? The green-haired man rubbed the back of his head as his cheeks turned pink. I dunno, I'm kind of clumsy. I think I would end up sending people away from the shrine instead. Nonsense, she replied, her face going sly. Plus, I'm sure Shouto would very much enjoy watching you perform, Izuku. His face turned bright red as he jumped a step away from her with a shriek. Don't say it like that. That sounds so inappropriate. She giggled mischievously, just as a man passing by gave Izuku a strange look. He waved sheepishly to the man, before hiding his face behind his hands in embarrassment. I forget that people can't see or hear you guys. I probably look crazy talking to myself, he groaned behind his hands. Tsuyu shrugged. Probably. Oh well, he sighed, running a hand through his messy green hair. It felt good to have it free again. Washing out Tsuyu's spit from the day before ended up being more of a pain than he expected. His body was still feeling a little off from his sole time traveling for such a long amount of time, but he didn't regret it at all. He was one step closer to getting Shouto home, and he was going to do whatever it took to get him back. The memory of past Shouto mourning over his mother was embedded in his mind. He felt guilty witnessing such a personal moment, but also a little confused about it all. When Shouto had told him about his mother once before, he had mentioned knowing she died but not remembering her death. Izuku hummed in thought as he looked to the sky. It couldn't have been coincidence that Shouto had no memory of ever taking the Sea King's eye and no recollection of his mother's death, since the two happened very close together. So what made him lose his memory? That also made Izuku wonder who the human was that Shouto was in love with. Did he forget about them too? He imagined Shouto being with someone, just the thought alone making him grimace. Jealousy was a gross feeling, and it made Izuku feel a little sick. He looked around, searching for a distraction, and tried to focus on the nice scenery that surrounded them. It really was a beautiful day. The sun bright while the sky was scattered with pretty white clouds. There was a soft breeze moving through the air that Izuku enjoyed, as it made the sun's rays feel a little less intense on his skin. The streets were busy with people, everyone out and about in little to no clothing to try and keep cool in the summer sun. Smiles were spread on most faces, and while the positive feelings were infectious, Izuku had a hard time keeping a smile on his face. He was worried about the fox yokai. He hoped he was doing okay and that most of all he was safe. They were nearing the beaches, and his stomach began to churn anxiously. What if the eye wasn't there anymore? Or what if he can't find the right cave that he hid it in? Shouto's freedom was in his hands, and suddenly he was feeling a lot less confident in his original plan. 値poked him gently in the side. From her tone it sounded like it wasn't the first time she'd said his name. He stopped his muttering to look down at her. Sorry, what is it? If you're so nervous about finding the Sea King's eye, why not use a talisman to guide us? Ochako nodded her head eagerly in agreement. That's a good idea. It'll save you some time and worry so you're not just wandering around too. Izuku grinned in relief. Using a talisman would save him a lot of trouble, and he felt a little dumb for not thinking of it himself. He quickly swung his backpack forward, unzipping the large pocket to pull out a blank talisman paper and ink-dipped brush. The three of them moved to the side of the sidewalk, and laying the paper against a sign for support, he wrote out, "Lead us to the Sea King's eye." The talisman rose off of the sign and floated away towards the beaches. Tsuyu and Ochako jumped onto Izuku's back as he hurried after it, ignoring the strange glances he got. To a bystander, he looked like he was chasing after a paper that had been caught in the wind. Izuku struggled to keep up, especially after the talisman led them directly into the sandy beach. He shouted out apologies as he jumped over and around people, the beach busy and full of relaxed vacationers. The talisman showed no mercy, its pace only speeding up just as Izuku accidentally ran through a young boy and girl's sandcastle. "Hey!" Their father shouted angrily just as Izuku called out a sincere, "I'm so sorry." The chase continued on, the breeze doing very little to cool him as sweat dripped down his face, his breaths heavy as he continued to run. He cursed himself for walking so far away to hide the eye, as his side began to ache and legs grew tired. It was tempting to let some of his god powers take over, the extra burst of speed and energy incredibly appetizing. But with a frown, Izuku glanced around himself. There was too many people around, and the last thing he wanted to be doing was attracting more attention to himself. "I can help," Ochako offered as she leaned her head forward into Izuku's line of sight. "Why don't I make you a little less heavy?" When Izuku gave her a nod of approval, too out of breath to speak, she grinned wide in excitement. "I'm not going to make you completely weightless, but I bet you'll feel a lot better if I remove just a few pounds off of you." He felt a warm tap on the base of his neck, just beneath his curls, and then the most peculiar feeling spread through him. It was like he'd been carrying a 60-pound weight, and it was suddenly whisked away from him. Everything became lighter. His footsteps became faster and more graceful, and with a slight lean he dashed forward faster and faster than before. Ochako and Tsuyu's grips on his back tightened as he sprinted down the beach. Gasps of astonishment could be heard as he passed by stranger after stranger, his speed only quickening. He'd never ran so fast, so effortlessly in his life. "Ochako-chan," he yelled into the wind, his wide smile reaching up to his almost closed eyes. "Yes?" She squealed back, her head huddled together with Tsuyu's as they clung to the back of his t-shirt. With a great leap into the air, "The cave just a few more yards ahead," he replied. "This feels amazing." The girls laughed in glee as he made his final few jumps before stopping at the base of the cliff. It had definitely changed over the course of 300 years, but Izuku knew this was the spot. He gave the girls a nod as they jumped off of his back. The Sea King's eye radiated a special energy, one he recognized right away as he made his quick and easy ascent up the cliff's edge. Behind him, he could hear murmurs of strangers as they nervously watched him climb up the rocky cliff, but he knew he didn't have time to worry about them. Ochako's powers faded as he sat in front of the hole. The cave's entrance seemed smaller than he remembered, but with a final gulp he bent down low and crawled his way inside. "So tight," he grunted to himself as he squished his way through, the tunnel's walls scratching against his arms as he pushed his way forward. The pitch-black darkness, the cold dampness surrounding him, and the tight walls closing in on him was starting to become too much. His heart rate picked up as his movements slowed down. It was getting near impossible to move, and for a moment Izuku feared he wouldn't be able to back out either. Just as he considered giving up and leaving without the eye, there was a faint blue light that suddenly appeared right at his hands. He moved his face down, squinting through his long lashes at the tiny marble-like orb beneath him. If this truly was the Sea King's eye, it had significantly changed. It had shrunk down to the size of a tiny pebble, and what once was a brilliant and bold shade of blue was now much more muted, soft. Izuku picked up the tiny marble, turning it in his fingers to examine it. Despite its humble appearance, as soon as he touched it, he knew it was the same eye. The exhaustion he was feeling vanished and was replaced with a feeling of rejuvenating strength and an odd desire to create something. To go out and do something big and bold. Stiffly, Izuku pocketed the tiny eye and then began to make his way backwards out of the tunnel. "You guys," he called out as he blinked into the bright sun, standing up on his feet. "I got it." "Great," T yelled out from below, "'cause I just called our ride." "What?" Izuku looked down, his nose scrunching up in confusion before his eyes widened in bewildered shock. "Tsuyu-chan?" he shrieked as he pointed at the ridiculously bright, purple flying submarine that no one else seemed to notice. "What the heck is that?" People were beginning to stare now, but rather than at the flying submarine, they only stared at Izuku with concerned expressions. The submarine lowered itself down to the sandy beach, long enough for the girls to hop in through a side door, before it flew its way up to Izuku. There was a large window in the front of it that revealed some kind of blue-skinned mermaid steering the flying water vehicle. The door to the side of her swung open, and the mermaid bent herself back to poke her head through it. She waved a hand at Izuku, smiling innocently despite Izuku's aghast expression. "You must be Izuku-sama? My name is 𝗂𝗁. Welcome aboard the 𝗕𝗁𝗵𝗃." Traveling underwater at such a rapid speed was breathtaking. With his nose pressed against the cool glass, Izuku gaped in wonder at the sea world surrounding them. An endless variety of colors flashed by, strange and beautiful fish he'd never seen before continuing to pass them. He heard a polite cough behind him, and almost reluctantly, he turned away from the view to smile kindly at 𝗂𝗁. "This is your first time in a submarine, ain't it?" She grinned, hands on her hips as she stood proudly. Izuku nodded, his gaze staying focused on her face despite her distracting attire. Or lack of. Like Hado, the blue-skinned mermaid woman was almost entirely topless, except 𝗂𝗁 had on a bright teal strip of seaweed that lay across the top of her breasts, not doing much to hold them in place, as the bottom half of them looked as if they were about to slip out. Her short, messy hair was a darker blue, though shinier and brighter than Tenya's. She held Izuku's gaze, her own eyes a bright, captivating yellow, surrounded by long spider leg-like lashes. "I've only ever swam on the edge of the ocean," Izuku said, glancing back out the window. "I've never even been in a boat before." "Well, it's an honor to have you, land god. I think you're the 𝗕𝗁𝗵𝗃's first human, too." He thanked her sincerely, and then watched with fascination as she scooted herself across the carpeted floor back towards the front of the submarine. The dark blue scales on her tail shimmered, reflecting the yellow light that hung on the ceiling of the submarine that gave off the illusion of shades of greens. Despite having such a large tail that must have been heavy to drag around, Izuku was impressed by how quickly and gracefully she moved, her tail swishing behind her almost like a snake. Tsuyu and Ochako followed the mermaid yokai up to the front, and Izuku sat back against the soft cushions of the bench. He bit his lip nervously as he tried to mentally prepare himself for the Sea King's kingdom. He hoped the Sea King was a little more easygoing than Katsuki, though he had a feeling he would be since the Dragon Prince's temper seemed to be more of a personality thing than a royalty thing. With the eye tucked away safely in his pocket, he was excited to give it back to its original owner and hoped that they'd be forgiving about how much it had reduced in size. The motion of the submarine, the gentle hum of the motor, and the warm air inside all began to make Izuku feel a little sleepy. His eyelids began to flutter, struggling to stay open. Just as they blinked closed, long lashes tickling his freckled cheeks, there was the sound of a loud, low cough. Izuku let out a startled yelp, sitting up straight as he looked around in surprise. He thought they'd been the only ones on the submarine, and yet there was suddenly a very handsome yokai sitting across from him. The yokai was leaning forward, his large muscular arms resting on his knees as he grinned at Izuku. His hair was a little wild, tousled back and a light shining blonde that reminded Izuku of the warm sun. He wore a simple white short-sleeved top that hugged his chest and arms in a very flattering way, while his pants looked like expensive silk, shimmering like black seaweed in the ocean. On his cheeks were small slits, reminiscent of fish gills. What Izuku noticed right away, though, was the black eye patch he wore over his left eye, while his right eye was a bright shining blue that looked completely supernatural in the way it almost glowed. "So you're going to the Sea Kingdom?" the yokai asked, his grin never fading but turning a little amused at Izuku's surprised expression. Izuku slumped back against the chair, hand to his chest as he tried to catch his breath. He nodded, the man's smile contagious as he felt his own lips turning up as he spoke. "Yes. Sorry, I didn't expect anyone else to be here with us. Are you going there as well?" "Sure am. I actually live around there, haven't been home in a while, and I'm looking forward to seeing my family again." "But what brings you to this part of the world, land god?" He brought out a hand, offering it to Izuku. Izuku took it, shaking it gently and noticing how cold the man's hand felt. He was also surprised to be greeted like that, as he was used to yokai acting a little more traditional. "You can call me Izuku," he replied, slightly questioning himself but also surprised with how comfortable he felt with the stranger. "I'm just here on some business." "God things, huh?" The man pulled back his hand, kind smile never leaving his face. "Well, I hope you enjoy yourself. The Sea Kingdom is quite beautiful, and the food is delicious. Hope you like seafood." He gave Izuku what he was almost positive was a wink, though with only one eye it was a little hard to tell. Still, the young man cursed himself for the hot blush that quickly spread across his cheeks. "I do. I'm hoping it'll be a good trip." "You said you've been gone for a while? For how long?" "About a year. That may seem a little long to a human like yourself, but for us it's like I've been gone only for a couple of days." He turned to his side, opening up a small bag that rested in the seat next to him, before he pulled out a small box. "I was making these as a surprise for my partners." He opened the lid, revealing inside the white box 2 glistening rings made of white, beautifully colorful opal. Izuku awed, leaning forward to marvel at them. They were clearly meticulously crafted, hand-cut and with a personal engraving on each one. The first one said, "Brighter than the sun," and the other said, "All that is wonderful." A soft smile fell on Izuku's face as he looked back up at the yokai. "They're stunning," he said, his chest feeling warm at the love the yokai radiated. "Your partners will love them." "Let's hope." The yokai laughed, suddenly turning a little bashful as he turned the box around to look at them himself. His expression softened and he looked at the rings with a certain fondness. Izuku sighed quietly. He missed Shouto so much and hoped they could one day be in a relationship like that. Just as the man closed the lid, turning to put the small box back into his bag, there was a loud bang as the submarine jostled forward. Izuku fell out of his seat, just as the box went flying out of the yokai's hands. It flung towards a window on the opposite side, the lid popping off and the rings tumbling out. The yokai managed to grab the bench with one hand and the collar of Izuku's shirt with the other as the submarine shook and rattled loudly. With the yokai holding him back, Izuku was saved from crashing into the walls or hitting his head on any hard surfaces. After another few seconds, the submarine relaxed and continued back to its peaceful motion. Karikoko and the shrine spirits hurried back into the room, the 2 girls rushing to Izuku to make sure he was all right. "I'm okay, really," he insisted, as Ochako furiously looked him up and down. The blue mare woman sighed loudly, shaking her head as she glanced out one of the windows. "I'm so sorry about that, you guys. Whales are always bumping into us. The sea hippo is bright purple, and yet they still don't seem to notice us half the time." She moved away, turning to look at Izuku when her eyes widened in shock at the sight of the other yokai in the room. "You're here too?" "Oh, I am so sorry, 𝗕𝗫𝗄. It's quite all right, Karikoko." He cut her off, stepping forward to wrap an arm around her shoulders. "I know how thoughtless the whales can be. I'll be sure to let them know next time I'm chatting with them that they need to be a little more careful." "You're too kind." She paused again, cutting off her sentence as the yokai gave her shoulder a light squeeze. Her yellow eyes flickered over to Izuku, and then back to the yokai who was giving her a slightly odd, almost forced smile. She nodded in understanding. "Well, we're almost there, Izuku-sama." She half laughed, her voice a little strained. "So enjoy your last few minutes with the sea hippo before you get going." She hurried away, beckoning for the shrine's spirits to follow her. They glanced at Izuku, and seeing he was just as confused as them, they simply shrugged and then went after the mermaid. Izuku got up, turning to the yokai to thank him for keeping him safe when he saw the yokai man knelt down on the ground, looking under the benches. "Oh no," he groaned, sitting up to give Izuku an incredibly disappointed frown. "The rings. They must have gotten tossed around when the submarine was bumped." He got back on his hands and knees, continuing to search until he paused, hearing a loud sniffle. The blonde yokai looked up, his single eye widening in surprise as he took in the sight of Izuku. "You're crying," he gaped, quickly standing up to place his hands on Izuku's shoulders. "Why in the name of the ocean are you crying?" Fat tears rolled down Izuku's cheeks as he wept, his hands coming up to wipe them away, but the flow of tears only continued. "It's just, I know they were so important to you. They were so special. And it's my fault you lost them, because you grabbed me instead of holding on to them." Izuku was incredibly embarrassed to be crying in front of the pretty strong man, but his emotions were sincere and he truly felt awful. The love the yokai had for his partners had shown in the beautiful rings, and because of Izuku they were gone. "Young man." The yokai laughed, pulling Izuku into his firm chest and hugging him tightly. "You're far too kind. It's quite alright, I can remake them. It only took me 6 months to find the perfect opal and then another 5 months to cut and engrave them. I'll just make them again on my next voyage." "That's almost a whole year." Izuku sobbed in despair, pushing himself away from the yokai. "I'll find them, I promise." He immediately got down to the ground, diligently searching for the rings despite the yokai's soft protests. About an hour later, with one of the rings safely retrieved, Izuku continued to crawl around the submarine floor in search of the other. The blonde yokai had given up searching long before Izuku, but he seemed more than content to sit back and watch the land god hunt for the ring. Izuku felt a little embarrassed under the yokai's gaze, but he didn't let it distract him from completing his goal. If he could find the Sea King's Eye from 300 years ago, then he could find the second ring. He knew it was on the submarine somewhere, and he was going to find it. "We're almost there, you two," 𝗓𝗄𝗃 called out from the front of the submarine. "Tsuyu and Ochako have been doing an amazing job steering it, haven't they?" Izuku glanced up, surprised to hear that the girls had been the ones doing the driving of the submarine. He smiled proudly. That must have been fun for them. His smile soon turned into a joyous grin, though, as his eyes caught on to the sparkle of an object far back behind a pipe that lay in the corner of the submarine. With an excited yip, he hurried over to the corner and then let out a long, content sigh of relief. "I found it," he called out, picking up the ring and then raising it high above his head. "That you did," the yokai said happily, getting up to take it from Izuku. "Thank you so much, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. I hope someday I can repay you for this." With frantic waving hands, Asuka shook his head. No, don't worry about it. I'm happy I could help." He gave Izuku another warm smile, and then turned to put the rings back into the safety of their box where they belonged. Just as Izuku went to sit back down, the light outside of the windows turned dark, and the view was suddenly blocked by some late solid object. "𝗓𝗄𝗃 is parking the submarine, Kero," Tsuyu said, entering the seating area. Ochako was close behind her, bouncing lightly on her toes as she exclaimed with excitement, "We're here." She reached for Izuku's hands, pulling him to his feet. He gave her a wobbly smile, to which she only laughed. "Relax, you're so close to Shouto now. We'll save him real soon." The blonde fish yokai quickly pulled his bag over his shoulder and headed for the exit. "It was an honor to meet you, 𝗧𝗵𝗲. Thank you again for helping me find the rings." He waved a large hand goodbye, and then jumped out before Izuku could respond. 𝗓𝗄𝗃 stood by the door, watching the yokai leave before she turned to Izuku. "Did you know who he was?" "No?" Izuku shook his head, his face going red with embarrassment. "Oh gosh, I totally forgot to ask too. I'm so rude." He ran his fingers through his hair, shaking his head in defeat. Tsuyu tapped her chin in thought. I feel like I'd seen him from somewhere before. Maybe. 𝗧𝗂𝗁, who was he? She looked back out the door, sighing as she crossed her arms over her chest. I'm pretty sure he doesn't want me to tell you guys, I'm sorry. Though chances are you'll see him again soon. Anyhow, thank you all for being such lovely passengers. My apologies again for the little bump we had back there, but I hope you'll consider riding the sea hippo again someday. Of course, Izuku replied, hopping out of the doorway. Thank you so much for the ride. Goodbye, land god. And sweet shrine spirits. She waved, and then went back into the submarine, pulling the door shut behind her. Izuku was more than relieved to find he could breathe regularly in the Sea Kingdom. The shrine spirits explained to him how it was encased in a sort of bubble, which then reminded him of Hitoshi's shrine. He was grateful for the bubble of air, because without it he wasn't sure how he'd get about bringing the Sea King's eye back to Hado. As they walked down a cobblestone path, passing by various traditional buildings and architecture, he had a similar feeling to that of being in an aquarium. Instead of a cloudy sky above them, they were surrounded by countless fish, ranging in colors and size, that swam about and around the large dome-like edge. It was hard to focus on where he was going, as his head kept tilting up to gape at the creatures above. Ochako nudged him sharply, directing his attention to a petite woman who literally skipped towards them. She wore a short, flowing dress, the fabric reminding him of the fins of an angelfish. Her short, choppy hair was a faded pink color, though her roots appeared dark brown as if it needed a touch-up soon. Scattered across her face and ears were several piercings, so tiny and bright that it almost gave her the illusion that she was sparkling. Like the blonde yokai on the submarine, she had gills on her cheeks and arms, as well as little rainbow-colored scales along her pale bare legs. She raised her hand in greeting, her fingers moving to make a peace sign. You must be 𝗧𝗵𝗲. She made a quick bow, and then motioned for the three of them to follow her. Hado-chan has been expecting you. I'm AUu, best friend and girlfriend to the most cutest thing in the universe, and I'll be your guide for today. Congratulations, Izuku said slowly, unsure of what the yokai's current relationship status had to do with anything. Thank you, she replied enthusiastically nonetheless. I'm very lucky. 𝗧𝗂𝗁 led them down a pretty marble pathway, little specks of gold shimmering underneath her heels that seemed to never quite touch the ground as she pranced forward. The path led to a huge castle, its exterior walls shining of pearly white elegance. It stood at least 6 floors tall, rows of windows and balconies scattered about, and huge sections built atop each other. Izuku's mouth dropped in awe as he took in the gorgeous castle. He'd never seen anything so amazing. Tsuyu's tongue lashed out quickly, wrapping around his wrist to pull him along as he'd gotten a few steps behind. She pulled him forward, leading the impressed land god through the huge double doors that opened for them. They entered a grand foyer, the pearly floors a brilliant white, while on each side were 2 huge winding staircases that Izuku could barely imagine what they even led to. Directly in front of them, boldly framed in what Izuku guessed was real gold, was a beautifully painted portrait of 3 people, Hado and 2 male figures, one of whom Izuku felt like he vaguely recognized. He took a step closer to inspect it, but then the yokai woman redirected his attention to herself by clapping her hands together loudly. Welcome to the Sea Palace. 𝗧𝗂𝗁 grinned proudly, slightly snickering at Izuku's starry-eyed expression. You 3 wait here while I fetch my lady Hado and Sir Tamaki. She pranced her way up one of the staircases, her orange dress fluttering behind her. Her footsteps were light on the flooring, like soft taps as she went up swiftly. They watched her until she was out of their view, and then looked to each other. Did she say my? Ochako whispered. Tsuyu nodded, tapping her chin in thought. She did. Their relationships are very interesting. I'm glad whatever it is that they all have seems to be working out just fine though. While the girls continued to chat about the mermaids' polyamorous relationships, Deku silently walked around the foyer. He approached one of the staircases, almost shyly peeking up to see how high it went. It was incredibly intimidating to stand in such an extravagant room, as it made him feel especially small and poor. The shorts, t-shirt, and sneaker combo he wore felt incredibly out of place, and he wished he'd worn something a bit more nicer. Even so, he rubbed his slightly chilly arms and continued to focus on his goal. There was no obvious passages or ways to get to any sort of jail or dungeon. He doubted it would be on a higher floor, as dungeons commonly were placed more underground and hidden. Izuku frowned, a small frustrated sigh escaping his lips as he reminded himself to be patient. Shouto was close. Soon they'd return the Sea King's eye, and then his fox yokai would be by his side again. His fox yokai. Izuku felt his cheeks warm. When did I start thinking of Shouto as mine?